She knelt before the entire court and cleaned another woman's boots with her bare hands, not because she was weak, because she was waiting. For 3 years, Selena Virel had survived the Empire's cruelest palace by becoming invisible, the silent Omega who flinched at shadows and swallowed every wound without sound. King Valor Draven watched from his obsidian throne and felt nothing. He had crushed 7 kingdoms. He had never once lost. He had also never looked closely enough at the woman on her knees to notice that her hands weren't trembling. They were perfectly, terrifyingly still. If you've ever wondered what a queen looks like before she reclaims everything, stay until the end. Drop your city below. You're about to find out what the most dangerous thing in an empire truly is. It isn't the king. The banquet hall of the Obsidian Palace had been designed to make men feel small. Valor's architects had understood their king's psychology with precision. 30-foot ceilings of carved volcanic stone, columns so thick 3 men couldn't link arms around them, torch brackets hammered from the melted-down armor of defeated enemy kings. Everything in this hall was a monument to the fact that Varkoros had consumed the continent the way fire consumed dry grass, completely, without apology, leaving nothing behind but ash and the Empire's black banners snapping in every wind. Tonight the hall held 400 of the Empire's most powerful wolves, generals who had burned cities, lords who had sold other packs into chain collars to secure their own borders, ladies who wore the jewelry of dead queens like trophies. They ate Valor's food, drank Valor's wine, and celebrated a 7th military conquest with the particular kind of enthusiasm that people display when they're desperately relieved they weren't the ones being conquered. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a dais of pure black stone, King Valor Draven sat on his throne and watched his court perform loyalty the way wolves performed submission, with their throats exposed and their eyes carefully averted. He was 34 years old, and he had never once believed a single word any of them said. Valor's face was the kind of face that stopped conversations without meaning to. Not handsome in any courtly way, the bone structure was too severe, the jaw too heavy, the brow too deep set for the kind of soft beauty that noble artists typically painted. There were 2 scars crossing his left cheekbone, earned in a border skirmish when he was 19, and he had refused every healer's offer to minimize them, because even then, at 19, he had understood that visible damage made men afraid in ways that clean skin never could. His eyes were the color of iron left out in winter rain, not quite gray, not quite blue, perpetually cold in a way that suggested he had made some internal decision long ago about how much warmth any given situation deserved. The answer, historically, was none. He wore black, always. A heavy wool coat tonight, trimmed along the collar with obsidian wolf fur, the Empire's crest embossed in silver across his chest. No crown during banquets, a choice he had made deliberately because crowns were ornaments, and Valor had never needed ornaments to make a room understand who held the power inside it. Beside him, seated 1 precise step lower on the dais, Lady Seraphine Calloway held a wine glass in fingers that never quite relaxed. She was exceptional to look at. Most people, upon first encountering Seraphine, spent several seconds simply absorbing the architectural quality of her face. The high cheekbones, the dark auburn hair coiled at the base of her neck, the practiced curve of a mouth that almost always smiled and never reached her eyes. She wore a gown the color of deep wine, cut to remind every person in the hall exactly why the king kept her close, and her jewels were, as always, extraordinary. Rubies. Always rubies. Nobody in the court particularly liked Seraphine. Everybody in the court was extremely careful around her. She had been Valor's royal mistress for 3 years, occupying the space beside his throne with the absolute assurance of a woman who understood that proximity to power, sustained long enough, became its own form of power. She gave him nothing he needed emotionally and everything he required politically. Her father commanded the eastern trade routes. Her cousin controlled 2 of the 5 noble military councils, and her network of information moved through the palace's servant quarters like water through stone, slow and invisible and eventual. Valor didn't love her. He had never told her he did. He suspected she would have found the declaration unsettling if he had, the way a chess player is unsettled when an opponent makes a move that doesn't fit any recognized pattern. They understood each other with the particular clarity of two people who had never once tried to deceive each other about what the arrangement fundamentally was. Tonight, Seraphine was in a mood. Valor could tell because the angle of her smile had shifted approximately 3 degrees towards something that would, in a less disciplined face, have been a sneer. Something had irritated her in the last hour. He hadn't tracked what? He rarely tracked Seraphine's irritations until they became his problem, and when they became his problem, they usually became someone else's catastrophe. He reached for his wine and let his eyes move across the hall. That was when he noticed the Omega Maid. She moved along the far wall with the particular practiced invisibility of someone who had spent a long time perfecting the art of not being seen. Back slightly curved, chin angled down, steps measured to make no sound across the stone floor. She was carrying a pitcher of wine, refilling glasses along the outer tables without making eye contact with any of the guests, which was correct behavior for palace staff, and also the kind of self-effacement that Valor had trained himself to notice precisely because it was so studiously performed. He noticed it the way you notice a single instrument slightly out of tune in an orchestra, not loudly, not disruptively, just as a persistent wrongness that snagged the ear. There was nothing remarkable about her on the surface. The servant's dress was gray, deliberately nondescript. Her hair was dark and pulled back tightly. She was slender, slightly underweight in the way that palace servants typically were, fed enough to function and not enough to cost more than necessary. She had the posture of someone who had absorbed a lot of damage over a long period and learned to carry it without complaining. She looked, in every visible way, like exactly what the palace records listed her as. Celine Virel, Omega designation, 3 years of palace service, assigned to general banquet and cleaning duties, unremarkable, invisible, safe to ignore. Valor's wolf stirred. It was a small thing, less a reaction than a faint attention, the animal equivalent of a hound lifting its head slightly at a scent it couldn't yet identify. His wolf was not an excitable creature. It had been trained through years of combat and control into something more like a cold and precise weapon than the instinctive beast that most alpha wolves wrestled with. It did not stir at ordinary things. He watched the maid refill Lord Edric Vane's glass and move on. Then he looked away because the instinct didn't build into anything, and he had 7 generals to observe and a room full of people with competing agendas to monitor, and a faint disturbance in his wolf's attention was not a priority. He would think about this decision later. He would think about it for a long time. The moment that broke the evening came 40 minutes later, sudden and staged with the precision of a woman who had been planning it since before the first course. Seraphine stood. She crossed the dais with the particular deliberate grace of someone who wanted to be watched, wineglass still in hand, the rubies at her throat catching every torch in the hall. She descended the steps and moved through the lower tables with people parting around her the way a current parts around a stone, instinctively, without being asked. She stopped near the outer wall. She stopped directly beside Celine. The maid had been mid-pour attending to a lord at one of the outer tables, and she noticed Seraphine's approach the way prey notices a predator. Not with fear exactly, but with a sudden complete stillness. "Your pour is uneven," Seraphine said pleasantly. The lord whose glass was being filled suddenly found something extremely interesting on the opposite side of the room to look at. Celine straightened slightly and set the pitcher down. "My apologies, my lady." Her voice was low, controlled. The kind of flat, careful tone that someone produces when they have had years of practice at making no sound that could be construed as argument. Seraphine looked at her with the cool interest of a woman examining something that didn't quite meet her standards. "Are those wine stains on your collar?" "Yes, my lady. From earlier service. I apologize, I should have changed." "You should have." Seraphine tilted her head. Then, with the absolute ease of someone for whom power over others had become so natural it required no particular emotional fuel, she let her wine glass tip. Not accidentally. The motion was too clean for accident. A slight rotation of the wrist, controlled and deliberate, and dark wine cascaded down across the jeweled surface of her own boots in a crimson arc. The splash was loud enough to reach 3 tables. Every wolf in the immediate vicinity felt the temperature of the room change. Seraphine looked down at her boots. Then she looked at Celine. Clean that up, she said. Her voice hadn't shifted at all. Casual, almost bored, the way a woman sounds when asking someone to fetch a dropped handkerchief. On your knees! Use your hands! The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that 400 wolves produce when they are all, simultaneously, very glad they are not the person standing in front of Lady Seraphine. Celine did not move for one breath. One breath was all she allowed herself. Then she descended to her knees on the stone floor and began to clean the boots with her bare hands in front of the full court of Varkoros. At his throne, Vialor watched. He watched because it was happening in his hall, and he watched everything in his hall as a matter of discipline. He watched Seraphine's expression, which was that of a woman satisfied, the 3-degree irritation resolved into something smoother. He watched the court's reaction, the quick exchanges of glance, the particular careful blankness of powerful men and women, choosing not to have visible opinions about what the king's mistress chose to do to a servant. He watched the maid. She worked with the methodical focus of someone who had decided that the only path through a humiliation was to complete it without giving it any additional power. Her jaw was set. Her shoulders were level. She was not crying, which was the outcome Seraphine was almost certainly hoping for. The public tears that would confirm to the court that the hierarchy was working exactly as intended, that the people at the bottom knew exactly where they stood. The maid did not cry. And then she looked up. Later, Vialor would struggle to articulate what precisely happened in the 3 seconds after that. He would describe it to no one, because there was no person in his life to whom he disclosed observations about his own internal experience. But in his private memory, the moment would remain sharp-edged and strange. The maid's eyes lifting from the floor, silver gold irises catching the torchlight in a way that seemed, for a fraction of a second, to have nothing to do with reflected light at all. His wolf went completely still. Not the small, vague attention from before. This was the full stop. Every instinct in the animal dropping to absolute quiet, the way the forest goes silent before something genuinely large moves through it. His beast, which had never submitted, which had never lowered itself to anything, retreated a half step inside his chest without being commanded to. The Alpha King experienced, for exactly 3 seconds, the precise sensation of being studied by something he could not categorize. Then the maid dropped her gaze. She finished cleaning Seraphine's boots. She rose. She retrieved her pitcher. She walked back along the wall and disappeared through the servant's door, and the door closed behind her without a sound. Vialor set down his wineglass. Around him, the banquet noise resumed its normal texture. The self-congratulatory conversation of wolves celebrating conquest. Seraphine returned to the dais with her smooth walk, the rubies swaying, and settled back into her chair with the particular controlled satisfaction of a woman who had made a point and landed it cleanly. "The entertainment tonight is exceptional," she said to him, reaching for her own wine. Vialor said. He was still looking at the servant's door. But the palace at night was a different creature than the palace during court hours. During the day it ran on performance, the ceaseless theater of power, of rank, of who stood where, and who addressed whom with what precise degree of deference. The corridors filled with the sound of boots on stone, of hushed conversations that stopped when wrong ears approached, of the empire's administrative machinery grinding forward. At night it became architectural, emptied of most of its human content, and what remained was the weight of the structure itself. The obsidian walls that had absorbed 30 years of Draven rule, the torches burning lower in empty hallways, the silence that settled between the stones like something that had been waiting for the people to leave so it could finally breathe. Celine Virel knew these corridors the way she knew her own hands. She moved through the servants' passage behind the east wing without a torch, which was not unusual. Maids who worked late learned quickly that carrying light made them visible, and visibility invited additional tasks from anyone who spotted them. She had been invisible for 3 years in this palace. She intended to remain invisible for as long as the plan required it. The plan required patience. Patience was the one resource she had never run out of. She slipped through a narrow door into one of the storage rooms beneath the east staircase, a low-ceilinged space packed with linens and cleaning supplies, rarely checked after the evening shift ended. The room had no window, no torch mount, no reason for anyone to enter before dawn. She pulled the door closed behind her and stood in the dark for a moment. One hand braced against the shelving and let herself have 30 seconds. 30 seconds was what she allowed. The humiliation in the banquet hall had not broken her. She had known, when she felt Seraphine's approach, that something like that was coming. The woman had been escalating her provocations over the last 2 weeks with the particular focused attention of someone who had identified a target and was working methodically toward a conclusion. Celine had catalogued each incident with the same flat precision she applied to everything. The spilled soap water 2 weeks ago, directed with her own mop at Celine's work. The comment about her degraded omega smell in front of junior servants. The increasingly direct assertions of the mistress's authority over the servant quarters that Celine worked in. Seraphine suspected something, not the truth. If Seraphine knew the truth, Celine would already be dead. But some instinct in the woman, sharpened by 3 years of monitoring threats to her position, had latched onto Celine as a thing to eliminate, and she was working toward that elimination with the thoroughness of someone who liked to be certain before she struck. Celine had perhaps 4 weeks left before the escalation reached a point she couldn't manage from below. In 30 seconds she had processed this, named it, filed it, and let the emotion that accompanied it exhaust itself in the dark where no one could use it as information. Then she straightened her back and began doing what she had actually come to this room to do. She moved to the back wall of the storage space, felt along the stone until her fingers found the specific indentation she was looking for. A crack in the mortar that ran in a pattern too regular to be decay, too precise to be accidental. She pressed 3 points in sequence. A section of the wall shifted inward. Not much. 6 inches, enough for a person to slip through sideways into the passage behind the wall. A corridor so narrow and low that she had to tilt her head slightly to avoid the ceiling. It ran for 40 meters through solid stone, lit by a faint luminescence from the runes carved along its lower edge. Runes so old the palace's architects hadn't recognized them as active when they'd built over them. Celine knew them. She had been born knowing them. The same way she'd been born knowing the feeling of moonlight on her skin carried a specific kind of weight that ordinary wolves didn't feel. She moved through the passage until it opened into a small chamber below the palace's foundation level. A space that had existed beneath this ground for 300 years, long before the Draven family had placed their first stone. The chamber walls were carved from living rock and covered entirely in the interlocking seal script of the original Lycan dynasty. At the center of the chamber sat a low stone basin, perfectly circular, filled with water that held its own light. Celine knelt beside it. She pulled the collar of her servant's dress aside, baring her left shoulder, and studied the mark there. It was faint. She had suppressed it completely for 3 years, buried it beneath layers of deliberate omega signal pheromones, and the kind of absolute psychological compression that should have been impossible to maintain for this long. The mark barely registered as a slight discoloration in her skin, something a healer might attribute to an old scar. Beneath the suppression, she could feel it the way you could feel a fire burning in an adjacent room, not directly, but as heat through walls, the knowledge that something significant was alive on the other side of the barrier she had constructed. She needed it to stay suppressed. For 4 more weeks, she needed it to stay completely, perfectly suppressed. She pressed her palm flat against the water surface and let herself feel downward through the stone, through the foundation levels, through the ancient structures beneath the palace, along the network of dormant runes that ran like a root system beneath the capital city, reaching outward for kilometers in every direction. They were waking. That was the problem. That was what had been keeping her in this chamber for increasing hours over the last 2 months. The runes were activating on their own timeline, not hers, responding to her proximity after 3 years in the palace above them, the way deep water responds to a stone dropped from a height. Slowly at first, then with acceleration, and at a certain point without any possibility of stopping. She had perhaps 4 weeks before the suppression became impossible to maintain. 4 weeks to complete what she had spent 7 years positioning herself to complete. "You're too close," she said quietly, to no one, to the stone, to the water, to whatever remained of the women who had knelt in this chamber before her and understood what it meant to be the last living thread of a dynasty that had been cut. I know I'm too close. It has to be me anyway." The water held its light without answering. She stayed in the chamber for an hour, running calculations that had nothing to do with mathematics, assessing the conspiracy architecture she had been constructing for 7 years, layer by layer, identifying the weaknesses and the necessary accelerations. She had people embedded in the northern rebel factions. She had documentation, real documentation, primary sources, seals and sworn testimonies from the survivors of the Shadow Purge who had managed to escape the continent, of what Vialor's father had done. What Vialor's father had done was not a secret exactly. It was more the kind of truth that was known and never spoken, because the people who knew it had either been complicit or had been made to understand very efficiently that their survival was conditional on their amnesia. King Aldrich Draven had made a treaty with the true Lycan monarchy 28 years ago. He had come to the Moon Court as a supplicant, his own pack pressed thin by border wars on 3 sides. His bloodline's claim to the Empire's throne fragile enough that even his own generals were beginning to have visible thoughts about succession. The Lycan Queen had received him and offered alliance, genuine alliance, the kind of cross-bloodline cooperation that would have restructured the power distribution of the entire continent. He had come with flowers and a formal seal and 17 assassins hidden in the servants' wagons. The Shadow Purge had lasted 4 days. By the end of it, the Moon Court was silent and burning. Every Lycan adult of standing was dead, and the children Aldrich had declared compromised to justify their systematic execution, had been hunted down with the particular thoroughness of a man who understood that loose threads became nooses. He had missed one thread. Celine had been 8 years old. She had survived because her nursemaid, an ordinary wolf woman named Bryn, brown-eyed and unremarkable and fiercely loyal in the way that unremarkable people sometimes are, had hidden her in a food cellar for 2 days beneath a false floor, then walked her out of the burning court dressed in servant's clothes and transported her south through the Empire's back roads for 3 weeks until they reached the border territories. Bryn had died of the wounds she'd sustained getting Celine out. She had not mentioned this to the child until she couldn't walk anymore, and by then they were far enough from the capital that Celine had at least a chance. Celine had been 11 when Bryn died. She had sat beside her for 12 hours in a farmhouse belonging to strangers who hadn't asked any questions, and then she had stood up and kept moving south. She did not think about this often. She thought about it the way you think about a wound that is fully scar-tissued. It no longer bleeds, and the memory of bleeding is part of what makes you careful. What she thought about, consistently, methodically, every single day for 7 years, was Aldrich Draven's legacy and what she intended to do with it. Aldrich was dead. That was the one part of this story that had proceeded without her involvement. The man had died of a cardiac event 6 years ago, which Celine had received as news with a blankness that she recognized, eventually, as the specific disappointment of having an enemy removed before you could remove them yourself. His death had been too clean, too quiet, too unconfronted. His empire remained. His son held it. And his son had sat on that black throne tonight and watched a woman be forced to kneel on stone and clean boots with her bare hands, and had felt, apparently, nothing about it at all. Celine rose from the chamber, sealed the wall behind her, and moved back through the servants' passages toward the Maid dormitories. She was thinking about the king's eyes. That was the thing she hadn't accounted for tonight. Not Seraphine's escalation, which she had seen coming, but the other thing. The thing she had felt from the throne dais like a pressure change, subtle and sudden, during the 3 seconds she had made the mistake of looking up. She had looked up because for a fraction of a second her control had slipped. The humiliation hadn't broken her, but it had reached something, some layer beneath the constructed Omega persona, and the thing beneath it had briefly looked out through her eyes with an instinct that was absolutely not Omega. She had felt him notice. Not Seraphine, not the Lord at the table, the king. She had felt Valor Draven's attention land on her the way you feel a predator's gaze between your shoulder blades, a specific, particular pressure that had nothing to do with the social mechanics of a master noticing a servant and everything to do with one apex wolf registering the existence of something it couldn't categorize. She had shut it down in 3 seconds, dropped her eyes, reconstructed the persona, completed the task, and left. But the fact that it had happened at all was a variable she hadn't budgeted for. She lay on her narrow dormitory cot in the dark, listening to the breathing of the other maids, and considered the problem of King Vialor Draven with the same dispassionate precision she had applied to every other obstacle in 7 years. The plan did not require him to see her. The plan required him to be present and discredited when the truth emerged, to be the inheritor of a stolen throne, confronted publicly with the evidence of his father's treason, stripped of the empire's legitimacy in a single moment before too many witnesses for the military to suppress. The plan was not designed around his personal destruction. It was designed around the destruction of the structure he represented, the system that had allowed the purge to happen and then buried it under conquest and silence. What Vaelor Draven thought about a particular maid was irrelevant to that structure. What his wolf had done when it noticed her, however, was a complication she needed to assess. Alpha wolves and Lycan bloodlines had a history that predated the current empire by several hundred years. The instinctive responses were old ones, buried in wolf genetics below the level of conscious control, the body recognizing something that the mind had no framework to process. If his beast had registered something during those 3 seconds, he would feel it as wrongness, as a persistent low-level awareness he couldn't explain or dismiss. Vialor Draven was not a man who left things he couldn't explain unexamined. She would need to be more careful. She closed her eyes and slept for 4 hours, which was all she ever allowed herself on nights when she worked late, and her dreams were not about the banquet hall or Seraphine's rubies or the stone floor. She dreamed about a burning court and a woman named Bryn who had carried a child across 3 weeks of empire roads with blood soaking through her coat, and who had never once suggested they stop. The king did not sleep. This was not unusual. Vaelor had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in approximately 4 years, a fact he had never discussed with anyone, including the palace physician, whose professional usefulness he would have rated generously at 40% and whose discretion he trusted at roughly 20%. He slept in increments, 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes 4 when the previous day had been genuinely exhausting, and spent the rest of the night in his study working, reading dispatches, or doing what he was doing now, which was standing at the window of his private chambers on the palace's highest level and watching the capital city spread below him like something he owned. He did own it. That was the simple fact. Every light visible from this window represented someone whose life was governed by his decisions, whose safety or lack thereof was a product of his policy and his capacity for violence applied at the right moment in the right direction. He had been doing this for 11 years since taking the throne at 23 from a father who had handed it over while still technically alive, an abdication that had never quite looked voluntary to anyone who'd been in the room. He didn't think about that often either. The city was quiet this late. The capital of Varkoros was large enough that it was never completely silent. The outer market districts ran through the night. The harbor never stopped. There were always wolves moving between the residential sectors and the entertainment halls that served the empire's military population. But from this height, the noise compressed into something ambient and low, more like weather than activity. He was thinking about the maid. He was thinking about his wolf's response. Specifically, the half-step retreat, the absolute quiet, the sensation of standing in front of something unclassifiable. He had run this through his memory several times since the banquet ended, and each time the reconstruction produced the same result, which was that he had no framework for what his beast had registered. He had been in the presence of powerful alphas, including his own father, without his wolf retreating. He had encountered dominant structures throughout the empire's nobility, had assessed and categorized them with the efficient instinct of a creature that had never encountered anything it ranked below. His wolf was not a humble animal. It did not lower itself. What it had done tonight was lower itself, at an Omega maid who was cleaning boots off the banquet hall floor. Vaelor leaned his forearms on the windowsill and considered this with the patience of a man who had learned through long experience that the things that didn't make sense were the things most worth understanding. She was not what she appeared to be. He didn't know what she was. He didn't have a theory yet. But the gap between what his eyes had shown him, the thin, slightly too controlled servant girl with the carefully downcast posture, and what his beast had registered in those 3 seconds of eye contact was too large to attribute to error. He had made this mistake before, trusting his eyes over his wolf. Not recently. Not since he was 20 and a general named Sorrow had offered him what looked like a genuine alliance and turned out to be an assassination attempt so carefully constructed that he had genuinely not suspected it until his wolf had gone wrong. Quiet in the moment before the blade came out. He had survived that. He had not repeated the error. There was a knock at his study door. "Enter," he said, without turning from the window. Commander Aldous Rain came in with the particular careful energy of a man who was aware it was very late, and he was interrupting the king's private hours, and he had decided this was necessary anyway. Rain was 40, gray-templed, built like a supply wagon, wide and practical and reliable over long distances. He commanded the palace guard with the thoroughness of someone who had internalized the understanding that his job was to protect the king from threats, and that threats came in every conceivable shape. "Your Majesty, the Northern Dispatch arrived. At this hour." The rider pushed hard. Lord Commander Theron thought the contents warranted immediate delivery. Valor turned from the window. He crossed to his desk and took the dispatch from Rain's outstretched hand. A sealed document, the seal broken already by Theron's initial review, which was protocol. He read it in the manner he read most things, which was quickly and completely on the first pass, then sat with it for a moment. "The northern clans have consolidated," he said. "The Veldrath faction joined the Koreth in the last month," Rain confirmed. "That gives them combined strength of— I can read the numbers." Valor set the dispatch on his desk. "The interesting part is the banner." Rain was quiet for a moment. "The silver banner," Valor continued. "The writer's report says the consolidated force is operating under a silver banner, not Koreth's standard, not Veldrath's." He looked up at Rain. "What silver banner has any legitimate claim in the northern territories?" Rain's expression was the practiced blankness of a man who had learned, over years, that some questions the king asked were not questions he was expected to answer. They were questions the king was asking out loud because speaking the implication made it concrete, and the king preferred his threats concrete and named. "There hasn't been a silver banner in the northern territories for 28 years, Valor said. His voice was quiet, a specific kind of quiet. The same compression that happened when he was very still inside, which was when he was most dangerous. Not since the Shadow Purge. "No, Your Majesty." Which means either someone is using historical symbolism as a recruitment strategy, which is unsophisticated and also not nothing, or— He paused, picked up the dispatch again, read the final paragraph once more. "Someone with a claim to that symbolism is alive and in the northern territories and has chosen this particular month to make their existence known." Rain said nothing. "Get me a full inventory of the palace registry," Valor said. "Every servant hired in the last 4 years, employment dates, origin documentation, designation records." Rain blinked once. "Your Majesty." "Tonight, Commander." Rain left with the efficient speed of a man who understood that when the king asked for something tonight, the answer was never morning. Valor sat at his desk in the quiet study and looked at the dispatch for a long moment. Then he set it aside and looked instead at the wall to his left, the wall where a portrait of his father had hung for 11 years, before Valor had removed it 18 months ago. Not from sentiment, but because the portrait's presence had become a weight that interfered with his thinking. The wall was bare now. Smooth stone, slightly lighter where the frame had hung. He thought about a silver banner in the north. He thought about an Omega Maid with silver gold eyes who had not trembled during a public humiliation. He thought about his wolf going still. He sat with the implications the way you sit with a fire whose heat you haven't fully assessed yet, aware of it, not yet at the distance where you understand how large it actually is. Outside his window, the capital of Varkoros breathed and moved and lived without knowledge of the shape the next morning was going to take. The palace woke at the 5th bell. Celine was awake at the 4th, as she always was, already dressed and moving through the lower corridors before most of the palace's servant population had opened their eyes. She had learned early that the hours before general activity were the ones where she could move most freely, could slip between sections of the palace that would become crowded and observed by mid-morning, could check on the things that needed checking without explanations. The thing that needed checking this morning was in the East Wing archives. She had 3 minutes between the 4th and 5th bells to reach the archive room, retrieve the document she needed, and be visibly at work in the corridor outside the Great Hall before the senior housekeeper, Margot, began her morning count. Margot ran her staff inventory like a military roll call, which Celine had initially found useful. Predictability created space, but which had become increasingly inconvenient as her own movements needed to be less predictable. She moved fast through the lower passages, silent on the stone, carrying a cleaning bucket as plausible cover. A maid with a bucket was the most invisible creature in any palace, someone so integrated into the background architecture of servitude that the eye slid past her without registering a human being. She reached the archive room and slipped inside. The palace archives were supposedly accessed only by the senior administrative staff and the king's secretariat. This had been true in theory for 30 years. In practice, the lock on the archive room's secondary entrance was a model that a locksmith in the border territories had quietly taught her to bypass when she was 19, in exchange for 3 months of assistance with his accounts, and she had been accessing this room at will for approximately 2 years without anyone noticing. She moved to the eastern stack and found the document she needed by feel, third shelf, behind the land survey records for the lower provinces, a folder that had not been accessed in so long the paper had stiffened slightly at the edges. She opened it. The document inside was a copy, not the original. She had made the copy herself, 3 months ago, from the original she had located in the chamber below and brought up briefly to transcribe. But it was an accurate copy, every seal reproduced exactly, every signatory name and date verified against the primary source material she had gathered over 7 years of work across 4 countries. It was a treaty document, 30 years old. It bore King Aldrich Draven's seal in the upper left corner, and in the lower right corner, it bore the triple moon seal of the Lycan royal dynasty, co-signed by a queen whose name had been systematically removed from every official record in the empire for the last 28 years. Celine looked at the signature beneath the queen's seal. Not the queen's own signature, which was formal and dynastic, but the one below it, the smaller one. The countersignature of a dynastic heir recorded in the treaty as a secondary witness to the alliance. Her own name in a child's careful handwriting, with the designation that had been assigned to her at birth. Looking at it still did something to her chest that she had not managed in 7 years to completely prevent. It was a small thing, a brief tightening, a compression behind the sternum that lasted for 2 or 3 seconds and then passed. She did not label it. She simply waited for it to end. She had almost replaced the document when she heard the footstep in the outer archive corridor. Not the shuffle of a servant, not the measured step of an administrator. Something heavier, more deliberate. The particular weight distribution of someone trained to move quietly, but built on a scale that made complete silence difficult over stone. She was absolutely still for 3 seconds. Then she replaced the folder exactly as she had found it, brushed her hand once along the shelf edge to settle any dust disturbance, and moved back to the secondary entrance, not the direction the footstep had come from, with the cleaning bucket in hand and her heart beating at a rate she refused to let reach her face. She slipped out and pulled the door closed. She was 20 meters down the corridor, bucket swinging at her side, when the main archive door opened behind her. She did not turn around. She kept walking. "You." The voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of a voice accustomed to being heard across distances, not through volume, but through the particular carrying weight of absolute authority. A voice that had said "stop" and meant it enough times that the word had settled into the timbre itself. Celine stopped. She turned slowly, with the appropriate speed of a servant interrupted by someone of rank, not too fast, which would suggest alarm, and not too slow, which would suggest deliberate disrespect. Valor Draven stood in the archive doorway. He was not in court dress. He wore the practical dark clothes he evidently used for whatever he did in palace corridors at Fifth Bell, before the court woke. Fitted wool, no adornment, the sword at his hip the only mark of station, and also not actually a mark of station since it was clearly a working weapon rather than a ceremonial one, the hilt worn smooth at the grip from use. His hair was dark, slightly disordered, as though he'd come from a night of minimal sleep. His gray iron eyes were fully awake. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face during the banquet, not the cold assessment of a king monitoring his court, not the carved disinterest he maintained at public functions. This was something more focused, more still. She met his gaze for exactly the fraction of a second that was appropriate for an Omega servant encountering the king unexpectedly in a corridor. Then she dropped her eyes to the floor in the deferential posture, weight balanced, shoulders rounded, the complete performance. "Your Majesty," she said. Her voice was entirely correct, quiet, flat, carefully neutral. He said nothing for a moment. She heard him step out of the archive doorway and into the corridor. Her heart did not change its rate. This was one of the things she had drilled hardest over the most years. Controlling the physiological responses, keeping her pulse below the threshold that a proximity-sensitive alpha could detect. Not because she couldn't feel fear, but because she had decided a long time ago that fear was information she would manage internally and not broadcast. "What were you doing in this corridor at this hour?" he said. "Morning cleaning duties, Your Majesty. The eastern corridor is scheduled for first light maintenance." She held the bucket up slightly, not pointedly, just confirming its existence. Physical evidence was its own argument. Another silence. "Look at me!" The command was quiet and absolute. Celine raised her eyes. She met his gaze and held it, and this time she was 3 feet away from him instead of 20 meters. And he was not on a throne looking down at a hall, but standing on the same stone corridor floor at roughly the same level. And the gray iron eyes that assessed her from this distance were doing something that she recognized. The same concentrated inventory she applied to things she was trying to understand. He was cataloging her. She let him. She gave him the face she had refined over 3 years. The careful blankness of someone who had learned to have no visible inner life, who had flattened everything that could be read into a surface that offered no purchase. It was a face she wore the way armor was worn, chosen, deliberate, protective of everything behind it. "You were at the banquet last night," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Your Majesty. I served the Eastern tables during formal functions." "Lady Seraphine had you clean her boots." "Yes, Your Majesty." He was quiet again. She could see him processing. Not obviously, not with any expression change that the court would have recognized, but with the internal quality of someone who is setting information against other information and measuring the distance. "You didn't cry," he said. That wasn't what she had expected him to say. She held her expression. "My lady's displeasure doesn't require my tears to be valid, Your Majesty." Something moved in his face. Not the expression itself. His control was too complete for that. But something in the infrastructure beneath the expression, a slight shift in the muscles around his jaw that in a less composed face might have become a frown. "No," he said, after a moment. "I suppose it doesn't." He looked at her for another 3 seconds. Then he said, "Which archive shelf requires cleaning at 5th bell?" And Celine understood that she had been caught. Not in any way he could prove. Not in any way that was, on its surface, damning. She was a servant in a palace corridor at 5th bell with a cleaning bucket, and the archive room had been locked when she exited, and there was nothing to suggest she had been inside it. But Valor Draven had not built and held an empire by taking things at face value, and whatever his wolf had registered about her last night had sharpened his attention into something that was not going to be satisfied by the plausible answer. She had 4 weeks before the mark on her shoulder broke through suppression. She might have 4 days before the Alpha King decided she warranted more than an unexpected corridor conversation. "The outer frame, Your Majesty," she said calmly. "The frame around the archive door accumulates dust at the lower hinges. It's on the cleaning rotation." She watched him look at the archive door. She watched him look at the lower hinges. He looked back at her. "I'll need you to attend the morning briefing chamber as serving staff," he said. "Be there at the 6th bell." It was not a question. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said. He walked past her down the corridor, close enough that she could smell the cold night air still in his clothes, the particular scent of a predator who had been awake through the dark hours. And she did not watch him go, because turning to watch was not something an Omega Maid did when a king walked past. She faced forward. She listened to his footsteps recede, and she stood there in the early morning dark of the corridor with a cleaning bucket in her hands and the weight of a dynasty in her chest. And she recalculated 4 weeks down to something considerably shorter, and she understood, with a precision that felt like ice water moving through her, that the man who had just ordered her to the briefing chamber had not done it because he wanted better coffee service. He had done it because he suspected something. And Valor Draven, when he suspected something, did not stop until he understood it completely. The floor beneath her feet hummed, low, almost inaudible, More vibration than sound, more felt than heard. The runes far below the palace, deep in the old stone, registering the proximity of his alpha energy against the suppressed weight of her bloodline. The same way two magnetic poles register each other through walls. She felt the mark on her shoulder burn, briefly, like an ember touched by wind. She pressed her fingertails into her palm and killed it. 4 weeks. She had spent 7 years on this. 7 years of eating other people's discarded food and sleeping on narrow cots and swallowing everything that was done to her and keeping the mark on her shoulder cold and dark and absolutely invisible while the empire that had murdered her family continued operating 17 feet above her head. She was not going to lose it now. She was not going to lose it because a dead king's son had eyes the color of iron left in winter rain and a wolf that had noticed her from 20 meters away, and a particular quality of stillness that reminded her, inconveniently, and against every strategic calculation she had ever made, of what her mother's court had said about the alphas worth watching. Not the loudest ones, her mother had said. Never the loudest ones. The ones who go quiet when they're thinking. Those are the ones who see through everything eventually. Watch for the quiet ones. She had not expected the quiet one to be him. She picked up her cleaning bucket and walked down the corridor toward the east wing. Above her, in the stone, the runes pulsed once and went dark again. For now. The tray was heavier than it should have been. Not physically. Celine had carried heavier loads across longer distances in worse conditions than a palace briefing chamber before the 6th bell. But the water pitcher and the 4 cups arranged on the tray's lacquered surface suddenly had the specific weight of a thing she was carrying toward her own exposure. And that weight had nothing to do with her hands, and everything to do with what she had seen on the table in the 3 seconds before she controlled her face. Origin, unverified. 2 words. Vialor Draven's handwriting. She knew it from 3 years of cleaning his study, of moving around the edges of his desk without touching anything, of cataloging what he read and how he annotated it and what he left face up versus what he locked away. The handwriting was compact, angular, no flourishes. A man who wrote to record, not to impress. She set the tray on the side table. The briefing chamber held 5 people besides the king. Commander Rain stood to Vaelor's left with a second document in hand. Something recent, the ink not fully settled to the paper yet, the edges of the seal still sharp. 2 senior generals flanked the far wall. Lord General Morrow, 60 and weathered as old rope, and General Cass, younger, politically ambitious in a way she had tracked carefully for 18 months. The king's secretary, a thin man named Aldrich, named after the old king, which had always struck her as either loyal or deeply unaware, sat at the corner of the table with a pen already moving. None of them looked at her. That was the correct response. Servants in briefing chambers were furniture that poured water. You acknowledged the furniture by using it, not by seeing it. Vaelor had not looked at her since she entered. That was not the correct response. She poured water into the first cup with the steady hand of someone who had practiced stillness until it was indistinguishable from calm, and she listened to the room. The Consolidated Northern Force is now operating in 3 cells, Rain was saying. The Korath and Veldrath merger gives them approximately 4,000 wolves in the field. The 3rd cell is newer. We don't have reliable numbers yet, but the scouts put the encampment size at 200, possibly 300. Location, Vaelor said. The Ashwood Plateau, 6 days' march from the capital's northern gate at standard force movement. They're not marching. No, Your Majesty. They're recruiting, Vaelor said. The observation was flat, delivered the way he delivered most things, not as a conclusion he was proud of reaching, but as a thing that was simply true and therefore needed to be said. The Ashwood position is a demonstration point. They want the border territories to see them there before they move. Celine set a cup of water near the edge of the table closest to General Cass. Cass's hand moved to accept it without his eyes leaving the map on the table, and she felt, with the particular hyper-awareness she had maintained for 3 years, the exact direction of every gaze in the room. Vaelor's was not on the map. She moved to pour the next cup and did not look at him. "The banner," Morrow said. His voice had the roughness of a man who had spent decades outdoors in cold weather. "We need to talk about the banner." "We are talking about it," Vaelor said. "I mean directly, Your Majesty. A silver banner in the Northern Territories means one thing to the older clans. It doesn't matter if the claim is real or manufactured. The symbolism alone will pull fighters who wouldn't otherwise move. I know what it means. Then you know we need to move before the recruitment completes. Morrow's bluntness was the kind that a man earned through decades of being right often enough that kings stopped punishing him for the tone. If the third cell doubles in the next 2 weeks, it won't. The room went slightly quieter. The third cell, Valor said, is not operating on a military timeline. It's operating on a revelation timeline. He paused. Something is being prepared. Something that requires witnesses, the right witnesses, in the right position, before the right moment. He looked at the map. Which means whoever is running this has a fixed point they're working toward. We find the fixed point, we find the center. Celine moved to the far side of the table. She had poured 3 cups. One remained, and it was the cup closest to the king's right hand, and she needed to cross behind him to reach the appropriate side of the table without walking between him and the map, which was a breach of briefing room protocol. She moved behind him. She was 8 inches from his back. She felt his wolf register her proximity like a drop in atmospheric pressure. Not visibly, nothing anyone in the room would have seen, but the particular quality of his stillness shifted fractionally. The way a predator shifts when something enters its perimeter. She set the cup down. "Leave us," Valor said. She was already moving toward the door when she understood he hadn't said it to her. The generals exchanged a glance. Rain's expression did not change. The secretary capped his pen with the careful economy of someone who knew better than to ask questions and filed out of the room behind the others with the quiet speed of men who had received variations of this instruction before and understood what it meant when the king said it without a reason. The door closed. She was at the side table, tray in hand, facing the wall. "Set that down," Valor said. She set the tray on the side table. "Turn around." She turned around. He was standing. He had moved from the head of the table during the 10 seconds her back was to the room, which meant he had moved with deliberate quietness, and he was now positioned between her and the door, which was either incidental or not incidental, and she chose to treat it as not incidental because treating threats as incidental was how people died. He was looking at the registry document on the table, not at her, at the document. "Celine Virel," he said, "Omega designation, presented to the Palace Employment Office 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days ago, with documentation from the border settlement of Carnweth." He looked up. "Carnweth was destroyed in a border skirmish 8 years ago." She said nothing. "The settlement records that should have verified your documentation no longer exist," he said, "which is convenient. I was unaware of the settlement's fate when I presented the documentation, Your Majesty. I had acquired it through a resettlement assistance program in the southern... I know what you acquired it through." His voice hadn't changed temperature. It wasn't angry. It had the quality of someone who had already moved past the stage where the lie was interesting and arrived at the stage where the truth was. "What I want to understand is why." She met his eyes. "I needed work," she said. "The documentation was the most complete I could obtain. I wasn't aware it would be..." "Stop." The word landed with the specific weight of a thing that didn't need to be loud. She stopped. He moved to the table and pulled out the chair at its head. Not to sit, but to rest one hand on the back of it, a position that put the map and the registry document and her in his direct sightline simultaneously. His jaw was set. The 2 scars on his left cheekbone caught the morning light coming through the narrow window. "You've been in this palace for 3 years," he said. "In that time, you have been assigned to 6 different work rotations, which is unusual. Most servants settle into 2 or 3. You have requested 3 of those rotations yourself, and the 3 you requested give you access to the East Archive, the sub-level storage passages, and the East Garden, which is also unusual." She calculated, very quickly, how much he knew and how much he was inferring. He was inferring too accurately. "The East Garden," he continued, "backs against the wall that abuts the old foundation level, which hasn't been structurally assessed in 40 years because the access points were sealed." He paused. "Were sealed." Celine breathed in through her nose, slowly, and held the breath for 1 second before releasing it. "Your Majesty," she said, "I don't know what you believe you've found, but I'm a servant who requested rotation to the garden because the outdoor work suited my... You have calluses on your hands, he said. That don't come from cleaning. She stopped. The distribution is wrong, he said, almost conversationally, except that nothing about this conversation was remotely casual. Cleaning work produces calluses on the palm's outer edge and the base of the fingers. Yours are on the inner grip. Weapon training, extended weapon training over years. He looked at her hands. When I was 19, I had the same pattern. Took about a year of active court duty before it softened enough to pass for something else. He looked up from her hands to her face. So, he said, let's try this differently. Not who you are on the palace registry. Who are you actually? The silence between them was not comfortable. It was the silence of two people who were both fully aware that the next 30 seconds were going to determine the shape of everything that came after, and who were both, in their different ways, calculating it. Celine made a decision. Not the full truth. The full truth in this room, with no witnesses and no positioning and no prepared ground, would get her killed before she could reach the door. But she needed to give him something. Something that explained enough without explaining everything. Something that moved his attention toward a target that wasn't her, or not her yet, not until she was ready. I was part of a border household, she said, a minor noble family in the Kelm territories. They were destroyed in the consolidation campaigns 11 years ago. I survived. She kept her voice level. The documentation I have was obtained through people who help survivors rebuild enough of a paper existence to function. It's not legitimate. I knew it wasn't legitimate. I used it because the alternative was no work and no survival. Baelor was quiet. Weapon training? The household trained all its staff. The Lord was... She paused, calibrating. Cautious. Another silence. She could see him processing it, checking it against what he knew, running it for inconsistencies. It wasn't the truth, but it was a truth. The kind of story that had 1,000 real variants across the Empire's history of consolidation and conquest, and the wreckage those left behind in the border territories. It was plausible. It was even sympathetic in the particular way that Vaelor Draven would not respond to sympathy, but might respond to recognizing a survivalist logic he understood from the inside. You could have come to the palace under legitimate border survivor provisions, he said. There are programs. Programs administered by the same noble councils that oversaw the consolidation, she said. Your Majesty. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically. Nothing about this man was dramatic. But the infrastructure beneath the expression, the muscles around his jaw, the angle of his attention, shifted in a way that suggested she had said something that landed against something already in his thinking. He looked at the registry for a moment. Then he looked at her with the gray iron eyes that had been watching this empire for 11 years, and she understood that he had not decided to believe her. What he had decided was that she was worth more attention than a dismissed servant, which was better than the alternative and also considerably more dangerous. You're assigned to the morning briefing service for the next 2 weeks, he said. You'll report to Commander Rhine for the schedule. Yes, Your Majesty. If I find inconsistencies in what you've told me... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The Empire had a language for unfinished sentences in this register, and it was fluent in consequences. You won't find inconsistencies, she said. Your Majesty. He looked at her for one more beat. Dismissed, he said. She picked up the tray and walked to the door and opened it and walked through it, and the door closed behind her, and she stood in the briefing chamber's anteroom for exactly 2 seconds with the tray in her hands and her breathing controlled and her face absolutely still. Then she walked down the corridor toward the servants' stairs. She had bought herself time. She did not know how much. The East Garden in winter was stripped down to its bones. The palace had 3 garden spaces. The formal South Garden, which was maintained year-round for court functions and looked exactly like power arranging flowers for its own entertainment. The West Courtyard, which functioned as a training ground and smelled of sweat and iron even in freezing temperatures. And the East Garden, which was technically decorative but had been allowed to develop over 30 years into something wilder than the gardener's original intentions. The stone paths half hidden under root growth. The walls thick with ivy that had cracked the mortar in places and been left to continue cracking because no one who made decisions about the East Garden went there often enough to notice. This was why Celine had requested East Garden rotation. She worked through the mid-morning with a rake and a wheelbarrow, clearing the dead growth from the path edges, and she was completely alone for almost an hour before she heard the footstep behind her. Not Veilor. Different weight distribution, lighter, with a particular heel-first quality that Celine had catalogued 3 weeks ago as Lady Seraphine's. She did not turn around. "You're still here," Seraphine said. "Yes, my lady," Celine continued raking. "I expected you to have taken yesterday's lesson as a resignation notice." Seraphine moved into the garden with the deliberate ease of a woman entering space she considered hers, which was most spaces. "Some of the staff have a touching commitment to endurance, don't they? I've always found it more exhausting than admirable." Celine pulled a clump of dead ivy from the wall base and deposited it in the wheelbarrow. "You're not going to say anything?" Seraphine said. "My lady didn't ask me a question." The sound was the particular variety of amusement that wasn't actually amused. Seraphine moved along the path until she was in Celine's peripheral vision, not quite in front of her, but close enough that the position required Celine to choose between turning toward her, which would be engagement, or continuing to face away, which could be read as disrespect. Celine continued raking. "The king asked Commander Rain for your registry document this morning," Seraphine said. Celine's thoughts did not change their rhythm. The rake moved through dead leaves with exactly the same pace it had maintained for the last 40 minutes. "I know," Celine said. A pause. "You know," Seraphine repeated. The quality of her voice had changed. The bored drawl compressed into something more focused. "That's an interesting response from a maid who cleans boots." "I was present when Commander Rain received the order, my lady. The briefing chamber doesn't have large walls." "And you're not concerned?" "Should I be, my lady?" Another pause. Longer this time. Celine pulled a second clump of dead growth and turned to the wheelbarrow. In doing so, she moved her body to a position where she could see Seraphine's face without making the sightline obvious, and she assessed what she saw with the same efficient precision she applied to everything. Seraphine was watching her with the expression of a woman who had expected to see fear and had encountered something else instead. Not confidence. Confidence in a servant would have been legible and manageable, the kind of thing you crushed before it spread. What she was encountering was the absence of fear, which was different, and which the particular animal intelligence of a woman like Seraphine correctly identified as a different category of problem. "The king's attention is not something a servant survives being noticed by," Seraphine said. Her voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. "In my experience, the people who draw it and don't know why tend to find the experience clarifying in ways they weren't prepared for." "I'll keep that in mind, my lady." "I'm sure you will." Seraphine turned, moving toward the garden gate. Then she stopped. Didn't turn back, just spoke toward the ivy-covered wall at the garden's edge, the words landing behind her with the precision of something aimed. "You should know that I've asked the housekeeper to pull your full employment record, all 3 years, every rotation request, every room assignment, every scheduled deviation." Celine kept her hands on the rake. "That's quite thorough, my lady," she said. "I'm a thorough woman." A pause. "Whoever you actually are, and I do think you're someone, which is the most interesting thing I've concluded about you, you're running out of floor to stand on." She walked through the garden gate. The latch clicked. Celine stood in the empty garden with the rake and the dead ivy and the sound of her own breathing, and she did her mathematics again. And the mathematics had worsened. 2 fronts, both accelerating, both moving toward the same point. She had managed one secret for 3 years in a palace full of people trained to locate threats. She had managed it because she was systematic, because she never varied her persona, and because she had been, until 48 hours ago, genuinely invisible. The banquet hall had ended that. The moment of eye contact had ended that. She needed to accelerate. She leaned the rake against the wall and walked to the far corner of the garden where the ivy was thickest, where the mortar behind it had cracked in the specific pattern she had identified in her first month of East Garden rotation. She pressed her hand flat against the stone through the ivy, felt the vibration of the runes below. Lower, much lower, down through 40 feet of foundation stone, and closed her eyes. She had contacts in 3 places. The northern cell leader, a man named Aldrich Voss, not the secretary, a different Aldrich, the Empire had an unfortunate overabundance of the name, who had been positioning her documentation network for 7 years and had the primary source materials locked in a location the Empire's intelligence apparatus had not found. 2 former court witnesses who had survived the Shadow Purge and whose testimony, recorded and sealed, would constitute the evidentiary backbone of the public confrontation she had been building toward. And 1 contact inside the palace itself, embedded for 2 years in the administrative staff, who had been systematically building her access to the physical archive documentation. She needed to move all 3 timelines forward. The problem was that accelerating the timeline meant taking risks that the original plan had been designed to avoid. The plan's architecture was built on controlled revelation, the right truth in front of the right witnesses at the right moment, with enough surrounding structure that the Empire's response couldn't simply be to kill her and suppress the documentation before it reached the northern clans. The plan required the northern clans to already be in position when the revelation happened. It required the court witnesses to be on record with testimony that had been distributed, not just held. It required enough of the Empire's noble council to have seen the treaty document before Valor's forces could move to confiscate it. Accelerating even 1 week compressed the margins on every other element. But Seraphine was pulling her employment records, and Valor Draven was sitting at a briefing table with a registry document in front of him that said, "Origin, unverified," and beneath her feet the runes were warming without her permission. She could not hold this much longer at full compression. Something was going to give. She needed it to be something she chose. She pressed her palm harder against the stone and sent a message the way she had been trained to. Not through paper, not through contact, but through the old methods, the ones that required the bloodline to work. A pulse through the stone, a specific pattern, a code that only Aldrich Voss had been taught to receive, transmitted through the network of runes that ran beneath the Empire's foundation and emerged 60 kilometers north in a specific piece of stone in a specific building that her people had quietly acquired 3 years ago. The message was 4 words: "Move the documentation now." She pulled her hand back and stood in the ivy-covered corner of the garden and felt the mark on her shoulder burn for 3 full seconds before she controlled it down. 4 weeks was no longer the number. Bonk. The king read reports in the evening. This was a fixed habit, the one consistent variable in a daily schedule that shifted based on military necessity, court demands, and the particular crises that empires generated with the regularity of weather. From the 8th bell until whenever he slept, Valor Draven sat in his private study and read. Dispatches, intelligence reports, administrative summaries, the correspondence his secretary filtered for relevance. He consumed all of it the same way, with the same efficient attention, annotating in compact, angular handwriting and making decisions that would reach hundreds of thousands of wolves through the Empire's administrative machinery. Tonight, he was reading the East Garden rotation schedule. Specifically, he was reading the notes that Rain had compiled on Celine Virel's movement patterns over 3 years, compiled in 6 hours, which was impressively fast and reflected the kind of motivated efficiency that happened when the king's personal interest was clearly attached to a question. The pattern was striking, not because any individual rotation request was suspicious. Each one had a plausible surface logic, the kind of requested assignments that a capable and ambitious servant might accumulate over time to improve their skill set and therefore their position. But laid out together, sequenced chronologically, the pattern of her movement through the palace looked less like career development and more like a systematic approach to a specific destination. The East Archive, the sub-level passages, the East Garden against the old foundation wall. She had spent 3 years walking a spiral toward something in the palace's eastern foundation. He had sent 2 engineers to the foundation access point this afternoon. They had found the sealed passage that he expected. They had also found, and this was the part that was sitting with him, that the seal was old, which was expected, but that the stone around the seal was slightly warmer than the surrounding foundation. Not warm, slightly warmer, as though something below it generated a consistent, very low level of heat. The engineers had no explanation. Valor had a shape of one, but it was not a shape he had a complete framework for yet, and he did not deal in incomplete frameworks. He set the rotation schedule beside the registry document. Origin, unverified. Calluses on the inner grip. East Garden assignment, Third rotation request. 3 years of perfect studied invisibility punctuated by one moment of eye contact in the banquet hall where his wolf had done something it had never done. He thought about his father. He didn't do this often, and when he did it with the specific quality of attention that you apply to a structure you've inspected repeatedly without being able to find all the flaws. The knowledge that the flaw exists, the frustration of not having located it yet. Aldrich Draven had been many things. Strategically brilliant, personally ruthless, capable of the kind of long-view patience that empire building required. He had also been capable of the kind of thing that men with power and no restraint became capable of, which was the decision that their choices were above the accounting that ordinary men were held to. Valor had spent 11 years cleaning up the downstream consequences of that particular belief system. The border territories that still didn't trust the Empire's word because they'd learned what Draven words were worth. The noble families that had been bought rather than won. The administrative machinery that ran on fear because loyalty had been treated as an expense rather than an investment. He had never investigated the Shadow Purge. This was not an accident. It was a choice he had made at 23 when he took the throne. The choice that a new king must make between looking backward at what built the ground he stood on and looking forward at what he would build on it. Looking backward opened questions he would not be able to close again. It created instability at the exact moment he needed solidity. He had looked forward. He was aware that this had been the right strategic decision and also potentially a catastrophic one, and he had held both of those truths simultaneously for 11 years without resolving them, which was the particular weight that certain kinds of men carried and called the cost of governance. The silver banner in the north had changed the calculation. Because silver banners didn't appear without roots, and the roots of that particular symbol went down to a place he had systematically avoided looking for 11 years. He picked up a new sheet of paper. He wrote, "What survived the Shadow Purge." He held the pen over the page for a moment. Then he wrote, "And where it has been since." He set the pen down. There was a knock at his study door. Not Rain's knock, which was 3 sharp raps, but the softer double knock of the secondary staff. He said nothing, which was not the response the knocker expected, and after a moment the knock came again. "Enter," he said. The door opened. Seraphine. She came in with the practiced ease of a woman who had been entering this room for 3 years and had long ago made peace with the fact that she was never entirely welcome in it. She wore a dressing robe, which was either genuine casualness or a calculated performance of it. With Seraphine, those two options existed in a permanent superposition that Valor had stopped trying to resolve early in their arrangement. "You're still at the desk," she said. "I'm often at the desk." "It's past the 10th bell." He said nothing. He looked at his papers. She moved to the chair on the other side of the desk, a chair that she had installed there herself 2 months into their arrangement, on the grounds that having a place to sit made the space more functional for the occasional conversations they had in this room. He had not objected. He rarely objected to Seraphine's domestic decisions because they were usually either genuinely practical or irrelevant to anything he cared about. She sat. She looked at the papers on his desk with the particular quality of looking that she had developed over 3 years, interested without being explicit about it, taking in what was visible without reaching for what wasn't. "The servant," she said. You had Rain pull her records." "I did." "And you had her moved to briefing chamber service." "That's correct." Seraphine crossed her legs and settled back in the chair with the posture of a woman preparing to be patient. "I pulled her records too. Before you, actually." She paused. "The Carnweth documentation has the resettlement office's seal, but the seal format changed 4 years ago. Hers uses the old format, which means either she was processed before the format change or she obtained the documentation from someone who had old seal materials. Either possibility is interesting." Valor looked up from his papers. "You investigated her," he said. "I investigate everyone who makes me feel something I can't account for," Seraphine said. "It's a survival methodology that has served me adequately." Something in that landed with more weight than she'd intended. He could tell because she kept her expression precisely calibrated, and Seraphine's precision increased when she'd said something she immediately wanted to walk back. "What did you feel that you couldn't account for?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. She didn't break, Seraphine said finally. In the hall. Most of them, not all, but most, show something. Fear, resentment, the particular look of someone who's making a calculation about whether a response would cost them more than swallowing it. She showed me nothing. She paused. Nothing that I could see is different from nothing that isn't there. I've been wrong about that distinction before. It was, in Valor's private assessment, the most honest thing Seraphine had said to him in 6 months, possibly longer. She told me she's a border territory survivor, he said. Keln consolidation 11 years ago. Possible, Seraphine said. Convenient. The Keln documentation was mostly destroyed. Yes. The calluses on her hands are wrong for cleaning staff. He looked at her. I noticed in the hall, she said simply. He looked at the papers for a moment. Then he said, if someone wanted to place an operative inside this palace for a long-term intelligence operation, the optimal approach would be to select a designation that ensured invisibility. Omega designation, female, placed in general cleaning rotation. Long enough tenure to build trust and access. Rotation requests that create movement patterns without triggering security flags because each individual request is plausible. Seraphine was very still. An operative working for the northern cells, she said. That's one possibility. What's another? He looked at the sheet of paper where he had written 2 questions. I don't have another yet, he said, which was not entirely true. He had the shape of one. He had the sensation of his wolf going still in a banquet hall and the warmth in the foundation stone and the silver banner 60 kilometers north and 28 years of a question he had chosen not to ask. He was beginning to understand that the question had simply been waiting for him to be ready and was no longer willing to wait. I want her watched, he said, not obviously. I want to know every place she goes, every person she speaks to, everything she handles. Rain's people? Rain's people will do it, but she'll make them inside a week. Someone else. Someone she won't recognize as surveillance. Seraphine's mouth curved slightly. I have someone. Use them. She stood, smoothing the robe's front with the gesture she used when wrapping up a conversation. She paused at the door, turned back. The banquet, last night, she said. What I did. He waited. I'm aware it was an escalation, she said. Her voice was flat, factual, entirely without apology, which he respected more than apology would have been. My judgment on the threat level was based on incomplete information. It was, he said. A pause. The incomplete information being, she said carefully, that the threat level is higher than I calculated. Yes. She nodded once. Then she walked through the door, and it closed behind her with no sound. Valor looked at the paper. What survived the shadow purge, and where it has been since. He thought about a woman who had not broken in a banquet hall, who had spent 3 years walking a spiral through a palace towards something in the Eastern Foundation, who had calluses in the wrong place and eyes the color of silver in certain lights, and a 3-second gap of eye contact that had made his wolf go quiet, the way the forest goes quiet before something large moves through it. He thought about a silver banner in the north. He thought about 4 days, and what could happen in 4 days if the acceleration he was beginning to suspect was real. He turned to a fresh sheet of paper. He wrote, "Seal the East Garden access to the Foundation." Then he paused. If she went to the garden and found the access sealed, she would know the perimeter had changed. She would adapt. She would find another route or accelerate her own timeline in a direction he couldn't track. He crossed out what he'd written. He wrote instead, "Post 2 guards at the East Garden gate, rotation schedule. Visible but passive, not sealed, watched." If she was what the shape of his thinking suggested she was, and he still didn't have the framework complete, still didn't have all the corners of it, then sealing the access would push a confrontation before he was ready for one. And Valor Draven had not survived 11 years of empire by forcing confrontations before he understood what he was confronting. He would watch, he would learn, and he would be ready. He set down the pen and looked at the wall where his father's portrait had hung for 11 years before he removed it. The bare stone looked back, bulk, Selene found the guards at the East Garden Gate the following morning. She stood at the corridor junction that gave her a sight line to the gate without being visible from it, and she looked at the two guards posted there with the particular patience of someone reading a sentence in a language she speaks and doesn't particularly like the content of. Valor knew she was moving toward the Eastern Foundation. He didn't know what was there. If he'd known what was there, the response would not have been two passive guards at a garden gate. The response would have been something considerably more definitive. But he knew she was moving towards something, and he had moved to restrict the approach, and that meant the window for reaching the chamber below through the East Garden access was now closed. She had two other routes. The first was through the sub-level storage, the path she'd used to reach the chamber 100 times before, through the false wall in the linen room. The linen room was not watched, not yet. But if Valor was as systematic as she understood him to be, the rotation schedule that Rain had pulled would show the linen room access as part of the pattern within hours of someone who knew what they were looking for, applying the right analytical pressure. The second route was through the west passage beneath the palace kitchen, a route she had never used, that she had identified in her first year and held in reserve precisely for a situation like this one. It was longer, more exposed during daylight hours, and required passing through two sections of the palace that she had deliberately avoided being seen in for 3 years. She turned away from the garden gate and walked toward the briefing chamber, because it was nearly the 6th bell, and she was now assigned to briefing chamber service, and not appearing would be its own kind of answer. She poured water for generals and listened to Empire business, and kept her hands steady and her face precisely calibrated, and in the back of her mind she ran through the western approach, step by step, timing it, identifying the 2-minute window in the kitchen staff rotation that would give her clear passage. She could reach the chamber tonight. She needed to reach the chamber tonight, because the message she had sent through the stone 2 days ago had gone out, and Aldrich Voss would be moving the documentation, and she needed to send a follow-up with specific instructions about the timeline compression before he positioned the materials for the original date. She was pouring water into Morrow's cup when she felt it. The briefing chamber was discussing troop positioning in the northern approaches, and Valor was standing at the map, and he was not looking at her. And then he was. Not a glance. Not the supervisory sweep of a king monitoring his room. A direct look, held for 3 seconds, from a man who had spent the previous evening constructing a question about her that he had not yet answered. She met it, held it for 1 second, which was 1 second longer than an Omega Maid meeting a king's eyes, but 1 second shorter than a challenge, and then she dropped her gaze to the water pitcher. She heard him return his attention to the map. Her pulse had not changed. What had changed was something else, a shift in the quality of the air in the room, the particular pressure of two people who are each aware that the other is moving toward a confrontation and are each, independently, calculating how much time remains before the collision becomes unavoidable. Not much, she thought. Not much time at all. She finished service and left the briefing chamber with the tray, and she walked down the servants' corridor, and the mark on her shoulder burned the entire length of the passage, and this time she did not crush it immediately. She let it burn for 10 seconds. Then she pressed it down, hard. She turned the corner toward the kitchen wing. Tonight. It had to be tonight. The kitchen passages at the 3rd hour after midnight were nearly empty. Nearly. Selene moved through the west kitchen corridor with a candle she had no intention of lighting, using the low warmth of the runes through the floor as a navigation guide. They ran warmer as she moved east toward the foundation, a consistent baseline heat that she had used in the dark dozens of times. She moved fast, the servant's dress exchanged for the plain dark wool she kept in the linen room reserve, and she made it through the first passage junction and the second without incident. The third junction opened onto a short flight of stairs leading down. She was at the top of the stairs when she heard breathing behind her. She stopped. She turned. Valor Draven stood at the corridor junction 10 feet away, alone, without a torch, in the dark clothes he wore for his late-night hours. He was looking at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize, the particular focused quiet of someone who had finally reached the answer they had been working toward, and was sitting with the implications. He had not come here through the kitchen passage. He had come through a different route, which meant he had been ahead of her, not behind, which meant he had anticipated this and positioned himself before she moved, which meant his reconstruction of her movement pattern had been faster and more complete than she had calculated for. The calculation error was significant. She was 4 steps from the staircase that led to the foundation passage. Between her and those stairs stood the king. "The warming in the foundation stone," he said. His voice was very quiet in the passage. "The engineers said heat without a source. That's not infrastructure. That's not water pipes or old heating systems." He paused. "What's below this passage, Celine?" She said nothing. He took 1 step toward her. "I want to tell you," he said, "that I've been doing this for 11 years. Managing threats, managing deceptions, managing the people who come into proximity to the throne with agendas they've constructed carefully and concealed well. I'm very good at it." Another step. "And in 11 years I have never felt my wolf go still the way it did in that banquet hall, which tells me that whatever is below this passage is not a threat in the category I know how to manage." He stopped. He was 6 feet away from her now. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he said, "not as your king, as the man who is going to find out either way, and who is asking because there are versions of this that go differently depending on what you choose in the next 30 seconds. His jaw was set. His eyes were iron steady in the dark. "Who are you?" The passage was silent. The runes beneath the floor pulsed once, slow and deep, like something underground hearing a question asked above it. Celine looked at the man across from her, the man who had watched her kneel in his banquet hall and done nothing, who had spent 11 years governing the empire his father had built on the blood of her court, who had gone still in a room full of 400 wolves, because something in him recognized something in her that he had no framework for yet. She looked at him, and she made the calculation that 7 years of patience had been building toward, and she understood that the moment she had planned for was not the moment she was standing in. She had planned for a throne room, witnesses, documentation already in position, already distributed, already irretrievable. She had not planned for a midnight corridor and one man standing between her and the stairs, asking the right question at the wrong time. She reached up and pulled the servant's collar aside, baring her left shoulder. In the dark of the passage, with no torch and no moonlight, the mark should have been invisible. It was not invisible. It glowed. Faint silver-white light, the mark she had suppressed for 3 years burning through the compression like a coal through paper, the triple moon seal of the Lycan dynasty, the mark of the bloodline that had ruled before the empire of Arkaros existed, before the Draven family had done what the Draven family had done. She watched Valor's face. She watched the moment the framework he'd been building collapsed and rebuilt itself around a truth that was larger than any category he had available for it. His wolf did not retreat this time. It dropped to its knees. She felt it happen, the involuntary submission response, the thing his beast could not override because the bloodline hierarchy ran deeper than 11 years of empire, deeper than Valor Draven's considerable personal will, down into the genetic memory of every wolf that had ever existed in the continent's territory and remembered what the Lycan mark meant. His face did not change. His body did not move. Every external layer of the man held absolutely still, but beneath it, the Alpha King of Arkaros had just genuflected to a woman in servant's clothes in a midnight corridor, and they both knew it. Celine pulled her collar back into place. The light went out. "My name," she said, "is not on any current registry in this empire. It was removed 28 years ago, along with every other record of my family's existence, by an order signed by your father." She held his gaze. "You asked who I am. I am what your bloodline made a treaty with and then destroyed. I am the last of what the Shadow Purge was designed to eliminate." She paused. "And I have been in your palace for 3 years preparing to take back everything your father stole." The passage was silent. Valor looked at her. When he spoke, his voice was perfectly controlled. Not cold, not angry. Something that had passed through those temperatures and come out the other side into something more fundamental. "Then we," he said, "have a very significant problem." From somewhere far below them, in the stone foundation of the palace his father had built, the runes ignited all at once, every single one, simultaneously. And 60 kilometers north, a silver banner caught the wind. The runes did not stop. That was the first thing. the thing that told Celine the situation had moved outside the boundaries of anything she could manage through patience alone. The ignition beneath the palace floor was not gradual. It was simultaneous, total, the entire network firing at once the way a body fires when a wound finally exceeds what it can contain. And the light came up through the stone floor of the passage in thin lines of silver white that illuminated both their faces from below and made Valor look like something carved rather than born. She had suppressed the mark for 3 years through sustained, grinding concentration. She had maintained the compression through public humiliation and cold corridors and 4-hour nights, and the particular daily weight of watching the empire that had destroyed her family run its machinery directly above her head. She had not slipped once. The mark was not slipping now. It was being pulled. The network below had recognized her proximity and the fact of her revealed bloodline and was responding with the autonomic certainty of a body recognizing its own blood, and there was nothing she could do in this corridor to stop it, except leave. And leaving meant walking past Valor Draven, and Valor Draven was not moving. He was looking at the light coming through the floor. His expression was doing something she had not seen it do in 3 years of studying him from the edge of rooms. Not the cold assessment, not the political blankness, not the particular stillness he used as a weapon. Something had come undone in the architecture of his face. Not collapsed. Undone. The way a structure looks when one load-bearing element is removed and everything else shifts to compensate, and the compensation is visible in the tension of every remaining joint. He was a man who had just had 28 years of foundation pulled out from under him, and he was standing in a midnight corridor holding the weight of it without anywhere to set it down. She watched him choose, in real time, how to carry it. "The heat in the foundation," he said. His voice was compressed to almost nothing. "It's been warming for how long?" 3 years. She kept her voice flat. "It responds to proximity. I've been suppressing the response since I arrived, but the network it's old. It doesn't accept suppression indefinitely." He looked at her. "You've been standing above an active Lycan network for 3 years, he said. "In my palace." "In the palace your father built over it, yes." The silver light in the floor pulsed once, strong, and then subsided to its baseline warmth. The runes didn't go dark. They settled into the low, steady glow of something that had been waiting a very long time and was no longer interested in waiting. Valor looked at the floor, then at her. He made a decision she could see forming. Not the full decision, not the one that covered all the territory this revelation implied, but the immediate operational one. The decision about what happened in the next 10 minutes. "Come with me," he said. "To where?" "Somewhere that isn't a servant's corridor at the 3rd hour." She looked at him for a beat. "You understand," she said, "that if you're taking me somewhere to be held, if I wanted you contained, I would have had you contained 6 hours ago." His voice had the quality of a man for whom patience was not natural, but was chosen, repeatedly, as the more functional alternative to what he actually wanted to do. "I want to talk without standing above active old blood network infrastructure that I don't understand." She looked at the floor, at the faint lines of light still tracing the rune channels. She looked at him. "All right," she said. He took her to the map room, not the briefing chamber, which had too many entrances and was used by too many people in the morning hours, but the smaller map room on the 2nd level, a space that Valor used for his own strategic work, with one door, no windows, and walls covered in the territorial maps of the empire in every scale from regional to continental. It smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and the specific dusty weight of rooms that held a lot of information, and not many people. He lit the lamp himself, a detail she noted, not calling for staff, not using the pull cord that would bring a servant, doing it himself in the particular efficient way of someone accustomed to operating without help. He set the lamp on the central table and stood across from her with his hands braced on the table's edge and the maps of his empire spreading out behind him on every wall. She stood on the opposite side of the table and waited. "Tell me about the Shadow Purge," he said. "Not the version in the official record. The one you were present for." She had rehearsed this. Not this exact conversation. She had planned to deliver this truth in a throne room, with documentation already distributed, Not in a private map room at midnight with one witness who was also the inheritor of the crime. She had rehearsed it as a public confrontation with the architecture of witnesses and evidence surrounding it like walls. Delivering it here felt like building a fire in the open air, dangerous for different reasons. No walls to contain it, and no walls to protect it either. "I was 8 years old," she said. "My mother had just concluded treaty negotiations with your father's delegation. 3 days of formal sessions. The terms were favorable to both sides. The Lycan court provided legitimacy that the Draven claim needed at that point in the border war consolidation, and in exchange your father received full trade access through the northern territories and military non-interference for 7 years. She paused. The treaty was signed, sealed with my mother's mark and mine as secondary heir witness. 17 hours later, your father's delegation's hidden contingent moved through the servant quarters after the court had retired. Baelor's hands on the table didn't move. His knuckles were not white. This was the kind of control that was almost worse than visible distress, the absolute compression of a man holding something that would break the compression if he let it. "How many?" he said. She looked at him directly. 41 adults, 11 children. She let the numbers sit in the room for a second. The children were listed in the official documentation as casualties of an outbreak of the blood fever that struck the northern court that season. The adults were listed as having fled during civil instability. She paused. "The civil instability was your father's soldiers." The lamp flame moved in a draft neither of them had created. "I survived because my nursemaid hid me and walked me out," Celine said. "Her name was Bryn. She died 3 weeks later from injuries sustained getting me through the gate." She said this with no particular emphasis, not because it meant nothing. It meant more than most things. But because she had learned a long time ago that emphasis was something you gave to things you were still in the process of surviving, and she had survived Bryn's death completely, in the only way that counted, which was by not stopping. Baelor straightened from the table. He moved to the wall map, the large continental one, the one that showed the Empire's full territorial spread, the black Draven borders pressed against every neighbor they had ever consumed, and stood with his back to her for a moment. "The treaty document," he said to the wall. "You have it." "I have a copy. The original is in a sealed location outside the palace." "The northern cells?" "Yes." He turned around. "And the documentation is positioned to be distributed to the northern noble councils," he said, "which means the moment you're exposed or arrested, it releases automatically." She said nothing. "That's why you needed 4 more weeks," he said. "Not for your own timeline. For the documentation to reach enough hands that suppression becomes impossible." She looked at him steadily. "You've been in this palace for 3 years," he said, "working toward a public confrontation in which I am the inheritor of the crime, in front of my own court." "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The silver banner in the north. Is that yours?" "Yes." "The consolidated northern cells, the Korath and Veldrath merger." "They came to me. Not the other way. The silver banner has its own gravity. I didn't manufacture the recruits. I simply didn't refuse them when they came." He processed this. She could see it happening. The systematic reconstruction of every piece of intelligence from the Northern Report through the new framework, the way a builder re-examines a structure when they discover the foundation is different than the blueprints indicated. "You have 4,000 wolves in the north," he said. "Documentation positioned for release. A network beneath my palace that just fully activated. And you've been standing in my briefing chamber pouring water for 6 days. 7, she said. Something crossed his face. "You are," he said slowly, "not the threat I know how to manage." "No." "I said that 2 days ago, and I understood it differently then." He looked at her. "What is it that you actually want? Not the confrontation structure, not the strategic outcome. What do you want?" She had not been asked this by anyone in 7 years. The people who worked with her didn't ask. They understood the goal as an objective to be accomplished, and objectives didn't have wants, they had requirements. And nobody else in her life had been close enough to ask, because she had not allowed anyone to be close enough. She answered honestly because she was tired, in the particular deep way that you get tired when you have been carrying something for 7 years, and you're standing in a room at midnight opposite the one person who has the framework, now to understand the answer. Accountability, she said. Not revenge. Accountability. The Empire acknowledges what the Draven bloodline did. The Lycan claim is formally restored. The people who were designated enemies and slaves for being something they were born, that designation is ended. She paused. And the systems that made it possible, the noble council structure, the Omega designation machinery, the administrative tools that allow this kind of thing to happen and stay buried, those are dismantled. Valor looked at her for a long moment. That's a significant rebuild of a functional empire, he said. It's the cost, she said, of what was done. Another silence. The lamp burned. I need time, he said, to think. You have until the northern documentation reaches distribution point, she said. After that, the timeline is not mine to control. How long? 10 days, perhaps 12. He nodded once, then he said, Don't go back to the Foundation passage. Not yet. The guards on the garden gate were a warning, not a lock. If you're seen accessing the Foundation level before I've had time to assess the implication of what's down there, the response from my military council will not be something I can intercept cleanly. She looked at him. You're not arresting me, she said. It was not quite a question. I'm telling you, he said, that if you give me 10 days to review documentation I was never given access to and determine whether the framework I've governed under for 11 years is structurally compromised. I can approach what comes next with more tools than you will have if you force this into a public confrontation before I've had time to assess my own position. She studied his face. Why? She said. He looked at her with the gray iron eyes. Because, he said, my wolf went to its knees in a corridor tonight, and I have spent 11 years not asking a question that I should have asked before I sat down on a throne that was handed to me without explanation of how it was obtained. His jaw tightened. And because I am not my father. The declaration sat between them without ornamentation. She looked at him for a long time. 10 days, she said. 10 days, he said. She walked to the map room door and opened it and stepped into the corridor. She did not look back. She did not trust him. She also did not distrust him, and those were not the same condition, and the gap between them was where everything dangerous lived. She walked toward the servant quarters through the dark palace and felt the runes warm in the floor beneath her feet the entire way. But on the fourth day, everything broke at once. The first signal was small, a thing she almost missed, which was itself the signal. In 3 years of palace life, Celine had built a precise internal map of the rhythms of the place. The specific texture of the morning corridor noise, the pattern of administrative staff movement between the secretariat and the briefing chamber, the particular quality of silence that settled over the East Wing in the early afternoon when the senior staff took the meal break. She knew these rhythms so well that deviations registered before she consciously identified them, the way a musician hears a wrong note before they name the pitch. On the fourth morning, she felt a wrong note. It was in the movement of the administrative staff, specifically in the absence of Harrow, the mid-level clerk who handled internal correspondence routing, from his usual position outside the secretariat at the 8th bell. Harrow was compulsively punctual, a man whose entire psychological architecture was organized around the comfort of predictable schedule. His absence from that position at that hour was, in 3 years, unprecedented. She noted it, filed it, kept moving. The second signal came 2 hours later. She was carrying linens through the west corridor when she passed close enough to the window overlooking the west courtyard to see the training ground. And what she saw on the training ground was wrong, in a way that made her slow her steps by a fraction. Not stop. Stopping would be visible, but slow enough to absorb it. The yard held twice the usual number of guards. Not in drill formation, which was the morning configuration. In deployment configuration, full equipment, the particular stance of soldiers who have been briefed and are waiting for an order rather than an instructor. She kept walking. She reached the linen room and she stood inside it for 60 seconds, and she thought. Deployment configuration was used for 2 purposes: external threat response, which required movement toward the palace perimeter, and internal security operations, which required stationary positioning at designated intercept points. The guards in the courtyard were stationary. Internal security. She moved to the linen room's back wall and pressed the sequence of points that opened the concealed passage, slipped inside, and moved fast through the dark toward the chamber below. She needed to know if the network below had been accessed. She needed to know if Valor's 10-day window had been a genuine offer or a strategy for buying the time to locate and seal what she had been moving toward. She was 40 meters into the passage when she heard voices. Not close. Below her and ahead. The chamber, the foundation level, the space that should have held nothing but stone and runes and the basin. She stopped. She pressed herself against the passage wall and did not breathe. 2 voices. Male. Neither of them Valor. Confirmed active. The entire lower network. Rain said the engineers almost missed it because the light signature is below the visible spectrum at surface level, but the heat signature is consistent across how old? The assessment puts the construction at 300 years minimum, pre-Draven, pre-Empire. The seal script on the chamber walls matches the Lycan dynastic records in the restricted archive. A pause. The records that Aldrich Draven had sealed. A silence. General Cass is going to want to see this before the king is briefed. Her blood went cold. Not Rain's people. Cass. The politically ambitious general with the Eastern Alliance connections who had been positioned in that briefing chamber for 18 months while she tracked his patterns and filed his behavior as a variable to manage later. Later had just arrived. She moved backward through the passage, silently, with the controlled speed of someone who has suppressed the impulse to run in favor of the more productive impulse to think while moving. She reached the linen room and pressed the wall closed behind her and stood in the room with the linens and her heartbeat and the mathematics of what she had just heard. Cass had found the chamber independently of Valor's investigation. Not through Valor's instruction, through his own intelligence operation, which meant Cass had been running parallel surveillance on the palace's Foundation anomaly, which meant Cass had been aware of or suspicious of the Eastern Foundation warmth before she had revealed herself to Valor 4 days ago. Which meant one of 2 things. Either the warmth had been noticed by Cass's people independently and he had been investigating it on his own timeline, or someone had told him. She moved quickly to the servants' stairs and went up 2 levels to the administrative floor, moving with the steady, unremarkable pace of a servant going about scheduled work. And she found what she was looking for in the 3rd corridor junction. Harrow's correspondence cart, parked outside the secretariat with the morning's routing documents loaded and undelivered. Harrow was not with his cart. She moved past it and glanced at the top document as she passed, without stopping, without appearing to look. A single second of peripheral intake. The routing seal on the top document was Seraphine's personal correspondence seal. Seraphine had not used her personal correspondence seal in 11 days. Celine knew this because she had been tracking Seraphine's correspondence patterns since the East Garden confrontation, cataloging every signal that the woman was accelerating her own timeline. She kept walking. She went to the briefing chamber anteroom and sat in the chair assigned to service staff and held the cleaning cloth she'd brought from the linen room and did the mathematics at full speed. Seraphine had sent correspondence, not through the standard routing channels, through a special dispatch, and Harrow had disappeared from his usual position the same morning that Cass's people were in the Foundation chamber with information they should not have had. Seraphine had told Cass about the chamber, or about Celine, or about both. Seraphine, who had been watching her for weeks, who had pulled her employment records, who had told her she was running out of floor to stand on, who was not stupid and not slow, and who had concluded, correctly, that whatever Celine was, she represented a threat to Seraphine's position beside Valor's throne that was categorically different from any threat Seraphine had managed before. Seraphine had gone to Cass because Cass was what you went to when you needed something done that bypassed the king. The implication of that sat in her chest like a coal. Valor didn't know. Or Valor was Cass's target as well, in which case, she stood and moved. Magentund. She found Valor in the East Passage. He was moving fast, which she had never seen him do in a corridor. He was always deliberate, always contained, movement that conserved itself for the moments it mattered. Seeing him at speed in the palace corridor had the same quality of wrongness as every other wrong note this morning, and she turned and fell into pace beside him without thinking about whether she should. He looked at her. "Cass," he said. "Cass," she confirmed. "His people are in the Foundation chamber." I know, I heard them. He didn't slow. Seraphine went to him 2 days ago. I found out 20 minutes ago. A pause. Tight. I should have found out 2 days ago. My intelligence channel inside Seraphine's correspondence network has been... It was compromised 2 weeks ago. I didn't know. She absorbed this. Compromised by Cass's people, she said. Yes. She matched his pace. What does Cass want? What Cass has wanted for 3 years, Valor said, and the compression in his voice had shifted into something with more heat in it, something she had not heard from him before. Not anger exactly, not the explosive kind, but the banked kind. The kind that had been building behind a dam for a long time and was beginning to find the dam insufficient. He wants the throne. He's been building toward it since his Eastern alliance gave him enough military weight to make the attempt viable. He's been waiting for a lever. A pause. You're the lever. She understood it completely and instantly. Cass didn't need the truth about the Shadow Purge to be credible. He needed the truth to be public, uncontrolled, distributed in the worst possible frame. The Alpha King concealing a 28-year-old massacre. The false foundation of the Empire exposed. The Northern cells mobilized and the documentation released before Valor had any opportunity to position himself relative to the revelation. Maximum chaos, minimum ability for the throne to respond, and Cass stepping into the vacuum with the Eastern Military Alliance, and a story about restoring order. He needed Celine's truth. He didn't need Celine. She was, in Cass's architecture, a tool that became a liability the moment it had been used. Where is Cass now? She said. He called an emergency military council session 30 minutes ago, before I was notified. Valor's jaw was set so hard she could see the muscle working beneath the skin. He has 7 of the 12 council seats. He's had them for months, and He stopped himself. Something moved in his face. I knew he had the alliance weight. I didn't move on it because the strategic cost of removing a sitting general without a formal treason case was... You waited, she said. Not an accusation. A fact. I waited, he said. The weight of it was in his voice. Not self-pity, that wasn't this man, but the specific acknowledgement of a wrong calculation made by someone who is usually right and has not yet metabolized the exception. And now he has 7 council seats and your documentation timeline and my intelligence channel and the morning. They stopped at the junction that led to the council chambers. Celine looked at the corridor ahead. At the end of it, through 2 sets of guarded doors, Cass was presenting her truth in the worst possible frame to the people who had the military weight to determine what happened next. She thought about 7 years. She thought about the plan, the controlled revelation, the documentation pre-distributed, the witnesses in position, the moment designed to be undeniable. She thought about everything she had built toward and the specific irony of having it taken from her not by Valor Draven, who was the enemy she had constructed the entire architecture around, but by a general she had assessed as a variable to manage later. Later had been a mistake. I need to get to the council chamber, she said. The chamber is locked in emergency session. Even I would require... I don't need a door, she said. He looked at her. The rune network runs under the council chamber, she said. There's a passage access point in the sublevel directly below it. If the network is fully active, she paused. I can reach the chamber from below. He was quiet for 2 seconds. If you walk into that chamber without preparation, he said carefully, Cass will have you arrested before you finish a sentence. He has 7 seats. He has authorization weight. Whatever you intend to say, I know what I intend to say, she said. It won't matter if you're in chains when you say it. She looked at him. Then come with me, she said. The words sat between them in the corridor. She had not planned to say them. She had not planned any of this. Not the timing, not the exposure, not the midnight map room conversation 4 days ago, and not this moment, standing in the East Junction with the wrong morning unraveling around them, and the plan in pieces, and the one option available to her requiring the cooperation of the man she had spent 7 years positioning as the primary obstacle. He held her gaze. She saw him calculating, the same rapid, systematic processing she'd watched him apply to everything, running it against the framework of what he knew and what he'd just learned and what 11 years of sitting on a stolen throne had actually been building inside him that he had not, until 4 days ago, had any reason to name. If I walk into that chamber, he said, I'm choosing a side, publicly, in front of 7 hostile council seats. Yes, she said, and the side I'm choosing is the truth, she said. That's all it is. That's all it has ever been. The side that says what your father did happened and is documented and is not going to be buried again. His breathing was controlled. His face was controlled. Behind both of those, she could feel his wolf, not retreating, not going still. Something else. The posture of a creature that has finally identified the direction it needs to move. My father is dead, he said. His empire isn't. He looked at her for a long moment. The passage, he said. Show me. The sublevel below the council chamber was different from the foundation chamber. Narrower, lower ceilinged. The runes here were less ornate, more functional. The supporting network rather than the primary nodes, etched into the stone with the workmanlike precision of construction designed to last rather than to impress. The light they cast was the same silver-white, steady and sourceless, and older than anyone alive. They moved through it without speaking. Vialor was a half-step behind her and to her left, the sword at his hip the only sound between them. The faint shift of the scabbard against his leg, barely audible. She stopped beneath the council chamber. Above them, through 6 feet of stone floor, she could hear the vibration of voices. Not words, not at this distance, but the specific quality of a room where people are arguing about something that feels, to them, settled. She placed her palm against the passage ceiling. The network pulsed beneath her hand. Warmer here, the current strong, the ignition from the other night still running at full capacity. She could feel the shape of the chamber above through the stone, 22 feet square. Stone flooring over the rune network. A single access point in the floor's northwest corner, concealed beneath the council table's end, sealed with the same kind of mortar and mark combination as the other foundation accesses. She pressed 3 points in sequence. Above them, the seal released. There's a panel, she said quietly. Northwest corner of the chamber floor. It will open upward. It'll make noise. How much noise? He said. Enough. He was quiet for a second. What do you need from me? He said. In there, specifically. She thought about this with the speed the situation required. Don't speak first, she said. Whatever Cass says when we come through that floor, don't respond to it. Let me establish what I am before you give the council anything to triangulate your position against. She paused. Then, when I've presented the documentation summary and Cass moves to have me arrested, and he will, I need you to override the arrest authorization. Using my authority as king, which you still have until 7 seats formally vote otherwise, yes. A pause. And if they vote otherwise, she looked at him. Then we'll have bigger problems, she said. She reached upward and pressed her palm flat against the panel. The mark on her shoulder ignited immediately. Not the controlled burn she had been managing, not the suppressed ember, but the full activation, the triple moon seal blazing silver white through her dress fabric as the bloodline and the network connected properly for the first time in 3 years. The warmth moved down her arm and through her hand and into the stone, and the panel above them began to glow along its edges. She heard Vaelor's sharp breath behind her. She didn't look at him. She pressed upward. The panel lifted. The noise it made was significant. She came up through the council chamber floor with the mark blazing through her dress, and the rune light rising around her like something that had been stored for a generation and had decided it was finished waiting, and the 14 faces around the council table, 7 of Cass's seats, 4 neutrals, 3 loyalists she had catalogued and never spoken to directly, turned toward her with the staggered, sequential shock of people who have been in the middle of one conversation and have just been interrupted by something from an entirely different category. General Cass was on his feet already. He was a lean man, 50, with the angular face and clipped efficiency of someone who had organized his entire existence around the precise management of advantage. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has just seen his lever become something he did not plan for. "Arrest her," he said, immediate and flat. 2 guards moved. Vaelor came through the floor panel behind her. The guards stopped. The room was absolutely silent. Cass looked at Veilor with an expression that, for exactly 2 seconds, showed the thing beneath the efficiency. The specific calculation of a man who has spent 3 years building a structure and has just watched the load-bearing element he thought was controlled step outside the frame. "Your Majesty," Cass said. His voice was controlled. "The situation is—" "I know what the situation is, General," Veilor said. He was completely still. He had come through a floor panel in the middle of a locked emergency military council session, and he looked like a man who had been waiting for this specific room for 11 years. "Sit down." Cass did not sit. "The council is in emergency session," Cass said. "The protocol for—" "I know the protocol," Veilor said. "I wrote most of it. Sit down." A beat. "The woman is a foreign agent operating under false documentation within the palace," Cass said. His voice had not risen. It didn't need to. He had 7 votes, and he knew it, and the knowledge was in every syllable like structural steel. "She has been surveilling restricted palace infrastructure. She is connected to the Northern Rebel consolidation. These are grounds for immediate—" "Her name," Veilor said, "is not on your arrest authorization." Cass looked at him. "Her name," Veilor said, and the quality of his voice had changed. Not louder, not harder, but deeper. The register he used when he had finished calculating and arrived at a position he was not going to move from is Celine Virel. And before this council votes on anything connected to her, you are going to hear what she has to say. Because what she has to say is something that belongs to this council, to this empire, and to every wolf in this room. He looked at Cass steadily. "And then we'll talk about what you've been doing with Eastern Alliance funding for 3 years, he said. "And whether the Seraphine correspondence you acquired 2 days ago was through legal channels or through the intelligence network you've been running inside my palace without authorization." The temperature of the room dropped. Cass had 7 seats. He also had the particular expression of a man who has just discovered that the position he believed he controlled has been observed from outside, and the observer has been considerably more systematic than he calculated for. Celine stepped forward. She looked at the council, at the 14 faces, at the 4 neutrals who were watching this with the alert calculation of people who had not yet decided which way this would fall, at the 3 loyalists who were looking at Veilor with the specific relief of people who had been waiting for him to step into something and had not been certain he would. She reached up and pulled aside her dress collar. The mark blazed. In the full light of the council chamber with 14 wolves in the room, the triple moon seal was not ambiguous. There was no framework in which it was ambiguous. Every wolf in that room had bloodline memory that predated the Draven Empire, and bloodline memory didn't ask for explanation. She heard 3 of the neutral seats make a sound she recognized. Involuntary, suppressed immediately, the specific caught breath of a wolf whose instinct had just fired without permission. "My name," she said, "is Celine Virel, last heir of the Lycan dynastic bloodline. I have been in this palace for 3 years, gathering and verifying the documentation of what Aldrich Draven did 28 years ago with the cooperation of the members of his court who are still alive." She held the room. "I have witnesses, I have testimony, I have a signed treaty document bearing the Draven seal and the Lycan seal, co-signed on both sides, executed 3 days before the Shadow Purge." She paused. "I have the names of every council member who was briefed on the purge plan before it was executed and chose to be silent about it for 28 years. The room was not silent anymore. But the noise was not what Cass needed it to be. It was not the controlled outrage of 7 aligned seats moving to suppress. It was the more complicated noise of 14 people recalculating simultaneously. Cass looked at her, then at Veilor. His expression had flattened into something below the calculation, something she recognized as the face a man makes when he is genuinely, for the first time in years, uncertain about the ground beneath him. "This is a fabricated claim," he said, "designed to destabilize the Empire. The bloodline documentation is—" "The documentation," Celine said, "was distributed to the Northern Territorial Councils 3 days ago." That was not true. The distribution was scheduled for 6 days from now. But Cass didn't know that. And the 4 neutral seats didn't know that. And in the 2 seconds of silence that followed, She watched 3 of Cass's 7 seats exchange a glance that was not the glance of men who were certain their position held. Cass looked at her. She held his gaze. And in the calculation behind his eyes, she watched the load-bearing element of his plan, the control of timing, the certainty that he moved first and set the frame, shift and crack and begin to come apart. He had built his structure for 3 years. He had positioned his alliance weight and his correspondence access and his council seats and his intelligence network, and he had aimed all of it at a lever that had just stopped being a lever and started being something he did not have a framework for. He had built for a controlled detonation. He had walked into a fire that was already burning. "This council," Cass said, and his voice was still controlled. It was just controlled differently now. The efficiency compressed into something tighter, something working harder. Should vote on the arrest of an unauthorized individual who entered this chamber through an unsanctioned passage, before any claims of "Call the vote," Valor said. Cass stopped. "Call it," Valor said. "Your 7 seats. Call the vote right now, and let's find out if they hold." He was looking at Cass with the gray iron eyes and the particular absolute stillness of a man who has made a decision he is not going to reverse. And the thing behind the stillness was not threat, and was not anger, and was not the calculated performance of dominance that Selene had watched him use on every other person in every other room for 3 years. It was something simpler, and therefore more dangerous. It was a man who had decided to stop carrying the wrong thing. Cass looked at his 7 seats. 2 of them were not looking at him. They were looking at the mark on Celine's shoulder, the silver light still blazing through the chamber, the thing that their bloodline recognized before their politics did. Cass said nothing. The silence stretched. Valor turned to the council. "This session is adjourned," he said. "We will reconvene in 3 hours. Before we reconvene, every member of this council will have access to a full documentation summary of the claims presented here. After reconvening, this council will vote on a formal inquiry into the events of 28 years ago." He paused. "General Cass, you are relieved of your council seat pending investigation into unauthorized intelligence operations within the palace. Commander Rhine will escort you to the East Barracks." Cass looked at him for a long moment. It was the look of a man at the end of a structure he had built for 3 years, watching the architecture come down around him, not with the dramatic collapse of something that falls fast, but the grinding, settling, undeniable descent of something whose foundation has been removed. He turned and walked to the chamber door with the controlled dignity of a man who had not finished, and Selene did not mistake that for defeat. Cass was not finished. Cass would reposition, reach for his Eastern Alliance weight, attempt to move the confrontation to terrain where he still held advantage. But the timing was no longer his. The room emptied in the particular careful speed of people who had just watched a significant realignment and were processing what it meant for their own positions. The 4 neutrals left with their faces arranged into careful blankness. The 3 loyalists left with something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. In 4 minutes, the council chamber was empty except for Selene and Valor. She pulled her collar back up over the mark, which dimmed but did not go dark, and stood in the empty chamber with the rune light still glowing from the open floor panel and the weight of everything that had just happened settling into the room. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the door Cass had walked through. "He still has the Eastern Alliance," she said, "and he's not going to accept the reassignment." "No," Valor said. "He's not. He'll reach out to his alliance contacts before the 3-hour window is up." "Yes." "Which means we have 3 hours." He turned and looked at her. There was something in his face she had not seen before. Not the calculation, not the iron control, not the particular quality of a man managing an empire from behind absolute composure. Something that the last 2 hours had worn through, the way pressure wears through the surface of stone and finds the actual material beneath. "We," he said. The word sat between them. She had said it without thinking, the first time she had used it, and he had caught it the way he caught everything, precisely, completely, without letting it pass unremarked. She did not take it back. 3 hours, she said. Your documentation access, my network. If we move the distribution timeline up, it can be done, he said. If your network contact can receive an accelerated instruction. She thought about the stone, about the pulse she could send. Yes, she said. He nodded once. Then he looked at the open floor panel, at the rune light rising from below, at the foundation network of a dynasty his father had tried to erase and had instead driven underground where it had spent 28 years building pressure. "Celine," he said, the first time he had used her name without the servant address, without any address at all. Just the name, direct and unframed. She looked at him. "I want to see the foundation chamber," he said. It was not a strategic request. It was something else. The request of a man who needed to stand inside the thing he had been governing over without knowing it, and look at it, and let what it was reach him completely. She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. She led him down through the floor. The runes blazed when he entered the chamber, brighter than she had ever seen them, the walls alive with silver-white script, the basin at the center lit like something that held the moon inside it. Every surface of the chamber responded to the combination of his alpha blood and her Lycan mark, the way two frequencies respond when they find harmonic resonance, building, not canceling. He stood in the center of the chamber and looked at the walls, at the dynastic seal script, at the history his family had tried to erase, and she watched his face move through something she did not name because it was not hers to name. He stood there for a long time. "All of it," he said quietly, to the walls, to what the walls represented. "All of it was built on this." She did not answer. He already knew. He had known, she thought, longer than he had admitted to himself. Some part of him had been carrying it for 11 years in the weight he moved with, in the distance he kept from every person in every room, in the particular quality of a man who rules through fear because trust requires a foundation you're not certain you have. He turned to her. His face had changed, not softened. That wasn't the right word for this man. Resolved. The way a face looks when someone has stopped holding a contradiction and made a decision about which side of it they live on. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Specifically, everything." And Selena Virel, last heir of the Lycan dynasty, who had spent 7 years building alone, looked at the Alpha King of Arkoros and told him. The 3 hours became 90 minutes. Celine knew the moment the window compressed, felt it through the stone the way she felt everything through the stone now. The network fully active and running at a sensitivity she had not experienced since childhood, when the bloodline was new and untrained and registered every disturbance in the territory the way skin registers weather. The pulse came from the north. Aldrich Voss's confirmation signal, 3 beats in sequence, meaning the documentation had moved to secondary distribution, but the primary release to the territorial councils was under interference. Eastern Alliance interference. Cass had not waited for the 3-hour window. He had sent his dispatch within 20 minutes of leaving the council chamber, which meant he had moved faster than she had allowed for, which meant he had contingency infrastructure already positioned, which meant he had been prepared for exactly this failure state. She told Veilor he was already moving. The next 70 minutes had the compressed, grinding quality of a mechanism accelerating past its designed speed. Everything functional, nothing with the margin for error that careful planning provides. Every decision made on information that was 60 seconds old by the time it was actionable. Veilor pulled his 3 loyal council seats and 4 of the 5 military commanders who had not been absorbed into Cass's Eastern Alliance network, and he moved them through a series of rapid conversations that Celine observed from the edges of rooms, watching how he worked when he was working at full capacity without the performance layer the court required. It was different from what she had watched for 3 years. Faster, more direct, less architecture. He spoke to his commanders the way someone speaks when they have stopped managing the impression of certainty and are simply operating from it, and she watched the difference land on the men he spoke to. The particular quality of attention that soldiers give a leader who is not performing, but present. She sent the acceleration signal through the stone, her palm flat against the foundation wall in the sublevel passage for 40 seconds. The pulse pattern that told Voss to release the primary documentation to all 6 territorial councils simultaneously, immediately, without waiting for the original confirmation sequence. 7 years of careful timing collapsed into 40 seconds of vibration through stone. She felt it leave her hand and travel north, and she pulled her palm back and stood in the passage with the mark burning steadily. And the particular feeling that came after releasing something you had been holding for a very long time. Not relief, not yet, but the specific lightness of empty hands. Then she went back upstairs to help dismantle the empire that had destroyed her family. Duck. The Eastern Alliance forces arrived at the capital's northern gate at the second hour after midday. Not Cass's personal guard, that would have been manageable. What arrived at the northern gate was the military weight of 3 eastern territories moving in coordinated formation, banners up, which was either a declaration of war or a demonstration of force depending on how the next 6 hours resolved. And the distinction between those two outcomes was currently sitting in Valor Draven's hands. Celine stood on the wall walk above the northern gate and looked at the force below and counted. 8,000 wolves. Minimum. Possibly 10. Beside her, Valor was doing the same count with the particular quality of absolute silence that she had come to understand was not composure, but something below composure. The state a man reaches when the situation has compressed past the point where composure is meaningful, and what remains is the bedrock of how he actually functions. "The gate holds another 4 hours," said Commander Rain on Valor's left. "After that, the structural stress on the gate isn't the problem," Valor said. Rain was quiet. "The problem," Valor said, "is that Cass is inside the city." Rain looked at him. "He didn't go to the eastern barracks," Celine said. She had worked this out 20 minutes ago and had been waiting for the moment to say it with the surrounding information in place. "He went to the noble quarter. The 3 council seats that didn't break from him. Their residences are in the noble quarter, and the noble quarter has its own gate access to the south road." Valor turned to look at her. "The force at the north gate," she said, "is not the attack. It's the distraction." A beat of silence on the wall walk. Then Valor said very quietly, "He's coming in from the south. With whatever he has inside the city already," she said. "The Eastern Alliance force is there so that your military attention goes north. When the south gate opens from the inside—" "How many inside the city?" Rain said. "I don't know exactly," she said. "Based on the Alliance correspondence I've been monitoring through the stone network, I can pick up metal-to-stone vibration in the passages beneath the noble quarter. I'd estimate 200, possibly 250. Rain looked at Valor. Valor looked at the force below the north gate. He was doing the calculation she could see him doing. The split of his available force between the north gate defense and the south quarter intercept, the timing windows, the margin for error. "If you split the force and Cass's inside number is higher than estimated," Rain said carefully, "the south intercept could be overwhelmed before the north gate engagement resolves." "Yes," Valor said, "and if you don't split the force and the south gate opens—" "He's in the throne room before we have time to reposition." Valor's voice was flat. "I know the math, Rain." Silence. Celine looked north. She thought about the rune network, about the foundation chamber and what it connected to, about the fact that the network ran beneath the entire capital in a root system that predated every building above it by 3 centuries. She thought about what a fully activated Lycan network could do in an urban environment, and she thought about what it would cost her to do it. She had been suppressing the bloodline for 3 years. The network had been running at full activation for 2 days. She assessed herself with the same precision she applied to external variables, approximately 60% through the sustainable activation window. Past 60% on a network this old and this large, the physiological cost escalated non-linearly. She knew this from the historical records she had spent years locating. The queens who had used the network at full capacity in wartime conditions had required weeks of recovery. 2 of them had not recovered at all. She could use it to locate Cass's inside force, to track their positions through the stone vibration across the entire capital, give Rain and Valor a real-time map of an enemy movement that was currently invisible to them. The cost would be significant. She was going to do it anyway. "I need 15 minutes in the foundation chamber," she said. Both men looked at her. "I can track Cass's inside force through the network," she said. "Positions, movement, numbers. If I can give you a real-time read on where they are and where they're moving—" "You said the network activation has a physiological cost," Valor said. He was looking at her with the focused attention that she had stopped flinching from. "You told me in the chamber that sustained use passed a certain threshold. I know what I told you." "How significant?" She held his gaze. Manageable, she said, which was approximately true if you defined manageable generously. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Something moved in his face. The same undone quality she had seen in the map room, in the council chamber, in the foundation chamber when he had stood in the rune light and looked at what his bloodline had tried to erase, the thing that had been coming loose in him since the banquet hall. He looked at Rain. "Hold the north gate," he said. "Don't split the force. Let me see what she gets from the network before we commit to any position change." Rand nodded and moved. Valor looked at her. 15 minutes, he said. "I'm coming with you." She didn't argue. The foundation chamber at full activation was almost too bright to look at directly. The basin had overflowed its stone rim by 2 inches, the overflow spreading across the floor in a thin sheet of silver-white light that moved like water but was not water. Liquid energy. The accumulated charge of a network that had been dormant for a generation and was running now at the output of something that had spent 28 years building pressure. The seal script on the walls pulsed in patterns she could read the way she read text, each symbol cycling through its activation sequence in the order that indicated north to south current. The current was the signal. The current was the map. She went to the basin and put both hands in. The pain was immediate and specific. Not the pain of injury, but the pain of overloaded signal, like pressing your ears against the output of something that produces frequencies beyond the range the body was designed to process. She felt the network open beneath her like a continent revealing itself from altitude. The entire capital, street by street, passage by passage. The stone below every building and road and courtyard registering the weight and movement of wolves above it through the vibration of foot pressure, breath, heartbeat. She found Cass's people in 40 seconds. "Noble quarter south," she said. The words came out strained, which she had not expected. The network was pulling more capacity than she had budgeted for. 230, moving in 3 groups. The lead group is already at the inner wall of the Noble Quarter. They're inside the perimeter. She pressed harder. The second group is at the south gate mechanism. They're not waiting for a signal. They're already working the mechanism. Valor was behind her. She heard him move to the passage entrance. He was not going to stand here and listen while the gate was being worked. That was right. That was the correct response. He needed to move. "Third group," she said. 40 wolves. They're not moving toward the gate." She tracked the vibration pattern, felt the weight distribution through the stone beneath the palace itself. "They're moving toward the palace, the east passage. They're going to try to—" She lost the signal for 2 seconds. The network flickered, a gap she had not experienced before, the sustained use starting to eat through her capacity in the way she had known it would, but had hoped to manage for longer. She pressed deeper. "The east passage," she said. "They're targeting the foundation chamber." A hand on her arm. "Celine," Valor's voice, close. "You need to—" "I'm not done." She pressed through the signal gap, found the current again, tracked it north toward the third group's approach. They have something with them. Metal. A lot of metal. She felt the specific vibration signature of iron weight moving through stone vibration, the dense displacement of something carried. Chains. Seal chains, the kind used for suppressing bloodline markers, the kind Aldrich Draven had developed specifically for the purge. Cass had Aldrich Draven's suppression chains. She pulled her hands out of the basin. The signal cutoff was abrupt enough to make her stagger. The sudden absence of the network's input, like losing 4 senses simultaneously, the world compressing back to the single room around her with an almost physical shock. Valor's hand was on her arm. She became aware that she was breathing harder than the physical effort justified, that the mark on her shoulder was burning in a way that was not activation but strain, and that she had approximately 40% of her sustainable capacity remaining. She looked at him. "The third group has suppression chains," she said. "Old blood suppression. If they reach the chamber and seal the network, the documentation release fails," he said immediately. "Everything fails," she said. "The network is what's carrying the pulse to the territorial councils in real time. If it's suppressed, the distribution collapses. Voss's secondary copies would take weeks to reach. Then the chamber has to hold." He looked at the walls, at the runes, at the basin on the floor. How many in the third group? 40. The east passage has 2 access points, he said. He was already moving toward the passage entrance, already building the defensive geometry in his head. If I hold the upper access, you can't hold the upper access alone against 40 wolves, she said. I'm not proposing to do it alone. He looked at her. But I need you in this chamber, on the network, keeping the pulse running to the territorial councils while Rain handles the south gate and I handle the passage. She looked at him. If the south gate opens, she said, and Rain is overwhelmed, then the game changes, he said. But that's the game. That's what we have. She looked at the basin, at the silver light, at the foundation of everything her family had built, blazing in the ruins of the empire that had tried to erase it. She looked at him. Don't get killed in a passage, she said. Something moved in his face. Not a smile, not exactly, but the thing adjacent to it in a man who had spent a long time not allowing himself the expression. I haven't yet, he said. He turned and moved into the passage, and his footsteps faded into the dark, and she stood in the chamber and put her hands back in the basin, and the network opened under her palms like a city exhaling, and she held on. 1. The south gate opened 12 minutes later. She felt it through the stone, the massive iron vibration of the gate mechanism releasing, 230 wolves pouring through into the south quarter, the ground shaking with the distributed weight of running wolves in combat formation. Above and around her, the capital responded. The North Gate force hearing the South commotion and recalibrating, the North Gate defense scrambling to the new threat vector, the tactical coherence of Valor's positioned force beginning to fragment under the pressure of 2 simultaneous entry points. Through the network, she tracked Rain's response. She could feel the defensive line compressing southward, the stone vibration of massed wolves moving in organized formation, the particular rhythmic impact of a force that was moving fast but not running, the professional economy of soldiers who had been in this situation before. Rain was good. She had assessed him from the edges of rooms for 3 years, and she had assessed him as genuinely good. He was also outnumbered. She pushed more capacity into the South Quarter tracking, trying to build a real-time picture of the engagement for the runners she had positioned at the passage entrance with Valor's instructions. The network gave her vibration data, not visual. She could feel mass, movement, the kinetic signatures of combat impacts through stone, the difference between the purposeful weight of a charging wolf and the irregular vibration pattern of one falling. Rain's line was holding, barely, and moving backward. She was tracking this with 80% of her attention. The remaining 20% was on the east passage above her, where Valor had gone to hold the upper access point against Cass's 40 wolves and their suppression chains. She had not heard anything from the east passage for 9 minutes. She told herself this meant the passage was holding, not that the passage had fallen too fast to produce noise she could interpret. She told herself this and tracked Rain's retreating line through the south quarter and kept her hands in the basin and kept the pulse running north, the heartbeat signal that told Aldrich Voss and the territorial councils that the source was still active, still transmitting, still here. At 14 minutes, the east passage access point above her moved. Not the panel she and Valor had come through. The other access, the secondary entry that she had never used, that ran from the north side of the foundation level through a different approach. It was heavier than the panel, iron reinforced, the vibration of it moving transmitted directly into the basin under her palms. They had found the secondary access. She pulled one hand from the basin and reached into the fold of the dark wool she was wearing and found the short blade she had carried in the palace for 3 years without ever using. She put her right hand back in the basin and held the blade in her left, and stood in the foundation chamber of her dynasty with the rune light blazing, and she waited. The first wolf through the secondary access was not expecting her to be facing the entrance. She drove the blade into the gap between his armor plates before he had fully cleared the passage, felt the impact transmit up her arm, and stepped back as he dropped. The second wolf was through before the first hit the floor. She was already moving, not toward him, away, drawing him into the chamber rather than letting him hold the passage mouth where he had the wall to one side and the ceiling pressure of the narrow access above him. He was larger than her, significantly. He was also carrying suppression chains and not a drawn weapon, which told her Cass had sent this group to capture, not kill. Cass needed her alive and the network suppressed, not her dead and the network potentially martyred into some form of sustained automatic transmission. She filed this information in the half-second she had to work with. She used the basin as cover, putting it between herself and the wolf with the chains, keeping the stone rim between his reach and her position. The overflow of silver light on the floor making the footing treacherous for someone who didn't know the terrain. She knew the terrain. She had been in this chamber 100 times. He lunged across the basin. She stepped left, felt the chain scrape across her shoulder where it missed the mark by 4 inches, and drove her elbow into the exposed side of his neck. Not a killing blow, she didn't have the angle for it, but enough to stagger him, enough to put him wrong-footed on the silver overflow. He went down on one knee. The third wolf was through the access. She was looking at 2 of them, and the entrance was still open. She put her right hand back in the basin and sent a different pulse north. Not the heartbeat signal, but the distress pattern. 7 beats in rapid sequence. The pattern that told Voss the source was under immediate threat and to initiate the backup transmission protocol through the secondary node, the one in the Northern Territories outside the Palace network. She had built the backup for exactly this situation. She built everything for exactly the situation it was eventually needed for. That was the only methodology that worked. You didn't plan for what you hoped would happen. You planned for what actually could. The third wolf crossed the chamber in 3 steps and caught her right arm. The contact with the basin broke. The network signal cut. She felt it go out the way you feel a fire go out in winter. The sudden cold. The absence of warmth that had been so constant you had stopped registering it as warmth and started registering it as the baseline condition of existence. The chamber didn't go dark. The runes were running on their own momentum now, not her direction. But the map of the city, the read on Rain's position, the pulse to the north, all of it vanished. She had her left hand and the blade. She used both. The wolf holding her right arm made the mistake of gripping above the elbow rather than at the wrist, which gave her rotation that a wrist grip would have prevented, and she rotated into the grip rather than against it, and brought the blade up in the space his body had created by pulling her close, and felt it connect. He released her arm. She did not stop to see what his expression was doing. She was back at the basin with both hands in when the secondary access opened a second time, and the 4th and 5th wolves came through. And she understood that she was not going to be able to hold the chamber with a short blade against 5 wolves, that the geometry of the space did not allow it. The Cass had sent the right number for this room. The suppression chains were going to reach the basin. She did the mathematics in 2 seconds. She had the backup node triggered. Voss had the distress pattern. The Territorial Council distribution was either completed or it wasn't, and she had no way to know which side of that line she was on. She had perhaps 30 seconds before the chains reached the basin. She made a decision. She pulled everything she had left, the remaining 40% of her sustainable capacity, and then everything below that, the reserve that the queens in the historical records had described as the floor beneath the floor. The capacity that existed below the sustainable threshold and burned through the bloodline like fire through dry wood. She pulled all of it, and she pushed it into the network in a single sustained pulse. Not the heartbeat signal, not the distress pattern, the full activation sequence. The sequence that the dynasty had reserved for the moments when subtlety had failed, and what remained was the simple fact of a bloodline declaring itself to the territory. The chamber walls went white, not silver white. White. The difference between moonlight and the source of it. She felt it travel north through the stone at a speed that stone should not carry signals, felt it reach every rune node in the network simultaneously, felt the 60-kilometer reach expand and activate and blaze like a root system suddenly given water after a decade of drought. The capital's stone floor lit up in lines visible from the surface. She knew this because she could feel the vibration of wolves above reacting to sudden light beneath their feet, the scramble and confusion of combat-engaged soldiers distracted by the ground itself illuminating. The pulse reached the Northern Territories in the same moment it reached the palace walls. It reached the territorial councils in the same moment it reached the suppression chains. The chains hit the basin rim. The pulse had already left. She pulled her hands out and stepped back and watched the iron suppression chains settle over the basin with the particular sick finality of something that cannot be undone, and felt the network close under the iron's interference, the way a wound closes. Not gone, not destroyed, but sealed, compressed, the active transmission cut. But the pulse had gone. Everything depended on whether it had gone far enough. She stood in the sealed chamber, chest heaving, the mark on her shoulder burning with the particular quality of something that has been pushed past what it should have been pushed past. And she looked at the 5 wolves in the chamber with her and the suppression chains over the basin, and she made one more decision. She put the blade down. It hit the stone floor and rang in the chamber's silence. She looked at the 5 wolves. "Get Cass," she said. Her voice was rougher than she intended. "Tell him the network sent what it sent, whatever he came here to prevent. It's already done." The wolves looked at each other. "Or," she said, "hold me here and find out in 2 hours when the territorial councils respond." The sound of the battle reached the Foundation chamber as vibration, mostly. The coordinated impact of forces engaging, the deep floor-level shudder of wolves fighting at volume in the south quarter, the irregular percussion of the north gate holding under pressure. She sat in the chamber with the suppression chains over the basin and waited and tracked what she could of the outside world through the attenuated remains of the network's outer fringe. The nodes at the capital's edge were outside the suppression radius and still running, giving her a fragmented and partial picture of what was happening above. Rain's line had stopped retreating. That was the first thing she could confirm. The south quarter vibration had stabilized, not resolved. The engagement was still active, but the backward movement had stopped, which meant either Rain had found an anchor point or something else had changed the tactical geometry. She tracked north. The north gate force was still holding, but the vibration pattern had changed. The directional pressure was different, as though the force below the north gate had shifted its orientation, not pressing the gate, pulling back. Why would the Eastern Alliance force pull back from the north gate unless... The documentation. She sat with the weight of that for a moment. If the territorial councils had received the pulse, if the distribution had reached the right hands before the chains hit the basin, if the Northern Territorial Lords had responded the way 7 years of intelligence work suggested, they would respond to confirmed primary source documentation of a 28-year-old conspiracy. The Eastern Alliance force would have received counter-orders within minutes. The Alliance Lords, confronted with a documentation package that put them on record as military partners of the man who had suppressed Lycan dynasty records, would not hold a forward position at the capital's north gate while the territorial councils were in emergency session. They would pull back. She pressed her palms against the chamber floor and pushed through the peripheral nodes and tried to get a read on the north gate approach. The vibration was retreating. She breathed. She sat in the sealed chamber and breathed for a moment, and the mark on her shoulder burned with a steady, deep, exhausted heat, and she let it burn because there was nothing left to suppress. The access point opened. Not the secondary access, the primary panel, the one she and Valor had used. It came up from below, and Valor came through it with blood on his face and his sword drawn and 3 cuts across his forearm that had not been there 90 minutes ago. He stopped when he saw her sitting on the chamber floor. He looked at the suppression chains over the basin, at the wolves in the corner who were managing their posture carefully in the presence of a man who had come through a passage from a fight and was still running hot with the particular quality of someone who had been recently trying to kill things and had not entirely finished. He looked at her. "The East Passage held," he said. His voice was rough. "They flanked through the secondary access." "I know," she said. "I had enough warning." He looked at the chains. "The network, I sent the pulse before they hit the basin," she said. "Full activation. Everything I had." He was quiet for a moment, reading her face with the precision he applied to everything. "How much did it cost?" he said. She looked at her hands. "I'll manage," she said. He said nothing. He looked at her with the gray iron eyes, and she could feel him not believing her and choosing not to push it, which was its own kind of answer about how well he had learned to read her in the last 4 days. "Rain's holding the south quarter," he said. "The north gate force is pulling back. We don't know why yet, but the field commander is reporting a retreat in progress." "The documentation reached the councils," she said. "The Alliance Lords won't hold a forward position while the councils are in emergency review." He absorbed this. Then he looked at the 5 wolves in the corner. "Where is Cass?" he said. The wolves were quiet. "He sent you down here," Valor said. He had prior knowledge of the secondary access, which means he had access to sealed palace architecture documentation that requires clearance I did not authorize. He looked at the wolves with the particular quality of attention that made rooms go still. Where is he now? One of the wolves, older than the others, with the bearing of a man who has decided honesty is better than the alternative, said, "He was moving to the throne room when we came down. There were men with him. Personal guard, 6 or 8. Valor was already moving to the passage. Selene." He stopped at the entrance, turned back. "Can you walk?" She got to her feet. The mark burned and her hands were shaking slightly, a tremor she had not had before this morning, and the chamber floor was further below her than she was used to feeling when she stood up, a slight wrongness of balance that she recognized as the physiological cost beginning to manifest. She could walk. She could do more than walk. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for one beat, not assessing capability, something else. The look that had been developing over 4 days of proximity and midnight corridors and foundation chambers and crisis decisions made together, the look of a man who has stopped being able to look at a person with pure calculation. "Stay close," he said. They went up through the passage. The throne room smelled of smoke. Not palace fire, not yet, but the outer residue of combat smoke drifting in through the high windows, the south quarter battle visible from the throne room's upper apertures as a distant disturbance of air and sound, and the orange edge of something burning in the market district. The room itself was intact, lit by its full torch array, the obsidian throne on its dais at the far end holding the particular quality of an object that had absorbed too much history to be simply furniture. Cass stood at the base of the dais steps with 6 personal guard wolves flanking him in a loose half-circle. He was holding Seraphine, not forcibly. That was the detail that Selene processed first and filed as significant. Seraphine was not being held. She was standing beside Cass with her hand on his arm and her auburn hair coiled at her neck and the rubies at her throat catching the torchlight the way they always did, and she was looking at Violor with the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was not going to perform regret about it. Violor stopped at the throne room entrance. Selene stopped beside him. The distance between the entrance and the dais was 40 feet. "General," Valor said, "Your Majesty." Cass's voice was level. He had recalibrated from the council chamber. The man standing at the base of the dais steps had processed the setback and rebuilt around it with the speed of someone who had prepared for multiple failure states. The Northgate force pulled back. "I've received word that the territorial distribution occurred before the chamber network was sealed." A pause. "You've been thorough." "I had help," Valor said. Cass looked at Selene. "Yes," he said. "I see that." The quality of his voice had shifted. Not cold, not angry, something flatter. The effect of a man who has reached the edge of a structure and is assessing what lies beyond it with the engineering precision that had built the structure in the first place. 3 years, he said to Selene, "in this palace. I want you to know I didn't miss you because I wasn't looking. I missed you because you were extraordinarily careful." "I know," she said. "The documentation reaches the councils fully, and Voss's network circulates it to the border territories within a week," he said. "The inquiry convenes. Aldrich Draven's actions are formally acknowledged. The Lycan bloodline claim is validated by historical documentation and active network testimony." He paused. "And Valor Draven, as the inheriting king, is positioned as either the man who revealed the truth or the man who concealed it, depending on how today ends." He looked at Valor. "I can still give you the second option," he said. "The Eastern Alliance has weight that doesn't disappear because the North Gate force pulled back. The councils are in emergency session, but they haven't voted. The documentation is distributed, but interpretation is still—" "Stop," Valor said. Cass stopped. "You built for 3 years," Valor said. "I know how it was built. I've been watching you build it, and I underestimated the timeline, which is on me." He moved forward, 10 feet closed to 30. "But what you're offering me is what my father took. Another version of the same deal. Control of a story that doesn't belong to you, built on suppressing one that does." He walked 20 feet. "I spent 11 years on a throne that was handed to me," he said. I didn't ask how it was obtained because asking would have required me to do something about the answer, and doing something about the answer was not compatible with the governance stability I needed at the time. He kept walking. That was a choice. I made it, and I'm done making it. 10 feet. The 6 guard wolves shifted. Valor stopped. He looked at Cass across 10 feet of obsidian floor. Walk away, he said. Take the Eastern Alliance weight and the council seats and walk them back to the Eastern Territories and let the inquiry proceed. You'll be investigated. Some of what you've built will be dismantled, but you'll walk away. He paused. This is the only version of this I'm offering. Cass looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Seraphine. Something passed between them. Not love, not the kind that required it to be named, but the particular communication of 2 people who have been building toward the same thing and have reached the moment of the final calculation simultaneously. Seraphine's hand tightened on his arm, a small motion, telling him something. He looked back at Valor. The throne stays Draven, Cass said, even after the inquiry, even after the documentation is acknowledged. You keep the throne and the woman gets her formal acknowledgement and her institutional reforms and her bloodline restoration, and the empire stays intact. It wasn't a question, it was an assessment. That's what you're building. That's one version, Valor said. The shape of what comes after belongs to the councils and the territorial lords and the inquiry process, not to me unilaterally. That's a new answer for a Draven king. Yes, Valor said. It is. Another silence. Cass's hand moved. She saw it before the guard wolves moved, the specific micro-shift of a man who has finished talking and is transitioning to the other mode. She was already moving when the first guard came off the flanking position, crossing the throne room in the diagonal that the geometry allowed, putting herself between the guards line and the obsidian throne dais. The fight was not elegant. It was not the orchestrated precision of the training yard or the contained violence of a single opponent in a passage. It was the compressed, loud, physically brutal work of close-quarters combat in a large stone room with 6 opponents who were larger than her and better rested and not running at 40% of their sustainable physical capacity. She worked with what she had. 3 years of hiding had not dulled what had been trained into her before the Shadow Purge, and in the years after, in the border territories and the camps and the long work of positioning, she had kept the training current because survival was a thing you maintained daily or you lost. She was fast, she was precise, and she had the advantage of an opponent who saw Omega in her bearing and adjusted their threat assessment downward by a category, which was the last mistake the first guard made before she put him on the floor. Valor was engaged with 2 of them directly, which left her with the remaining 3 plus Cass, who was not a guard wolf but was not a soft man either. He had not climbed to general rank through politics alone. She tracked his position while managing the immediate physical demands, and she watched him move toward the dais steps with the purposeful efficiency of someone who has a specific objective regardless of what is happening around him. She understood the objective, the throne. If Cass reached the throne and occupied it during the engagement, the symbolism of the image, the general in the throne, the king in combat on the floor, the female wolf fighting beside him, was a political weapon that would survive the day regardless of how the physical confrontation resolved. Councils made decisions based on what they saw. Images of power were not neutral. She broke off from the guard engagement. 2 of the wolves followed. She let them, changing direction fast, drawing them across the room, away from Valor, who had the 3rd managed, creating the angle she needed. She reached the dais steps before Cass. He stopped. They stood at the base of the obsidian throne steps and looked at each other, and the fight was happening around them, and the sound of it was loud and irregular. And she was breathing hard, and her hands were not entirely steady, and he was breathing hard, and his face had the particular tight quality of a man who has reached the point of the gamble where the outcome is no longer fully in his control. It doesn't have to be you on that throne, he said, low and fast. It doesn't have to be him either. The documentation, the inquiry, the whole structure you built. It dismantles the Draven claim as effectively as it validates yours. The throne is open after the inquiry. There's a version where, no, she said, where what you want gets built faster without the weight of a Draven king sitting on it. No, she said again. He looked at her. You're protecting him, Cass said. not with contempt, with the analytical quality of a man updating a model. That was not in any version of this I planned for. You planned for 7 scenarios, she said. I know. I read the correspondence. You didn't plan for the one where he decided to stop being what his father built. A heartbeat of silence. Cass looked past her. She turned. Valor had the last guard down. He was standing in the center of the throne room floor, with the sword in his right hand and blood running down his forearm from the cuts the East Passage had given him, and a new one across his jaw from the engagement just resolved, and his chest was moving with the controlled breath of a man at the edge of exertion, maintaining the presentation of capacity. His eyes were on Cass. Cass looked at the throne, at Valor, at Selene, at the trajectory of everything he had built and the architecture of everything it had run into. He put his sword down. It clattered on the obsidian floor with the flat sound of metal on stone that meant something was over. The inquiry, he said to Valor. His voice was controlled. When it reaches my network, what I've been running inside the palace, I want it reviewed, not executed. The people who worked for me didn't know the full picture. That'll be for the inquiry panel to determine, Valor said. I'm asking you to advocate for it. A pause. I'll present the evidence as I have it, Valor said. The panel decides. Cass looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, the particular nod of a man accepting terms he didn't want because they were better than the alternative. He walked to the throne room door. He stopped. He looked back at Selene. You built better than I did, he said. Not admiringly, honestly, the assessment of one builder to another. 7 years, 1 operative, no resources. Better than 3 years and an Eastern alliance. A pause. I'd like to know sometime how you selected the Koreth contact. She looked at him. Voss picked him, she said. I told Voss to look for wolves who had something to be angry about and had been waiting long enough that the anger had turned into patience. Cass considered this. That's the only kind that holds, he said. He walked through the door. The throne room was quiet. Selene turned back to the dais. She looked at the obsidian throne, the seat of an empire built on what had been done to her family, the object she had been moving toward for 7 years through cold corridors and 4-hour nights, and the daily grinding work of being present in her own destruction site without letting it destroy her. She was standing at the base of its steps. It was 7 steps up. She stood there and breathed. Valor came to stand beside her. He was close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, the post-combat temperature of a body that had been working hard, and she could smell the blood from his arm and the specific cold night air quality she had catalogued in the corridor 8 days ago when he had walked past her and she had not watched him go. He looked at the throne. The inquiry will take months, he said, possibly longer. I know. The institutional reforms, the Omega designation, the Noble Council structure, the slave designation systems, those require council votes, territorial agreement, administrative machinery that moves slowly even when the political will is present. I know, she said. The empire doesn't become something different overnight because a general put his sword down and the documentation is distributed. I know, she said. That's why the plan was always structural, not theatrical. He was quiet for a moment. You told me what you wanted in the map room, he said. Accountability, restoration, structural dismantlement of the systems that made it possible. He paused. You didn't say what you wanted for yourself. She looked at the throne. 7 steps. She had spent 7 years on this. She had been 8 years old in a burning court. She had walked south for 3 weeks with a woman who was dying and who was too determined to mention it until she couldn't move anymore. She had not thought about what she wanted for herself in 7 years. She thought about it now. I want to see it finished, she said. I want to stand in front of the council and present the documentation myself. I want the names of the people who knew to be in the record. I want the record to be public. She paused. And I want it to hold. Not for a year, not for a generation. Structurally, built into the empire's foundation so that it can't be reversed by the next man who decides that the people below him are a resource rather than a population. That's going to require a Lycan presence in the governance structure, Valor said. Not ceremonial, functional. Yes. The council will fight it. Some of them, she said. Not all. He looked at her. Not all, he agreed. A sound from outside? The south quarter engagement shifting, the vibration of it through the palace floor changing quality, the momentum altering. Rain's line was moving again, forward this time. Your Majesty, Rain's voice from the corridor, controlled but rapid. The south engagement is resolving. The Eastern Alliance subforce is requesting terms. General Cass appears to have reached them with a ceasefire authorization. Valor looked at the door. Tell Rain to accept the ceasefire terms pending inquiry conditions, she said quietly. He looked at her. Tell him, she said. He turned to the door. Accept the terms, he said. Standard inquiry conditions. All personnel to present for registration. Yes, Your Majesty. Rain's footsteps receded. Silence. She and Valor stood at the base of the obsidian throne steps in the empty throne room, with the battle outside resolving into the quieter noise of a ceasefire, and the smoke smell drifting through the high windows, and the torches burning down toward the end of their oil. She looked up the 7 steps. Celine. She turned. He was looking at her with the gray iron eyes and the face that had been coming undone for 4 days. The face of a man who has stopped carrying the wrong thing and is still learning the shape of his own hands without it. The inquiry convenes in 3 days, he said. Before it convenes, I'm presenting the documentation to the full council, all of it, including my father's involvement in the suppression of what came after the purge, including my own failure to investigate for 11 years. He held her gaze. I'm presenting that myself. She looked at him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. That's not the point. She understood what the point was. The point was the difference between managing the revelation, framing it, controlling the narrative, presenting accountability in the most defensible shape, and simply standing in the room and saying what was true. He had been managing the Empire's narrative for 11 years. He was done managing it. She held his gaze for a long moment. All right, she said. He nodded once. Then he turned to the throne room door, and she turned to follow him, and the obsidian throne sat on its dais behind them, with the 7 steps leading up to nothing but the weight of what had been built on it. She stopped. She turned back. She walked to the base of the steps. She looked up. She climbed 6 steps. She stopped on the 6th step, one below the seat itself, the position that was not the throne but was not the floor either. And she turned and looked out across the empty throne room from the only height in this palace she had never stood at. The room looked different from here. Smaller, more manageable. The space that had seemed designed to make men feel small looked, from 6 steps up with the mark burning steadily on her shoulder and 7 years of work finally discharged, like what it actually was, a room. Stone walls and torches, and the accumulated weight of 30 years of fear-based governance, and the particular quality of a space that was waiting for what came next. She could hear Valor stop at the door. She didn't look at him. 6 steps, he said from the doorway. For now, she said. The room breathed. Outside the palace walls, a silver banner caught the wind above the northern gate of the capital of Varkoros, visible from the wall walk where Selene had stood 90 minutes ago, counting wolves below. And in the stone floor of the throne room, very faint, too deep to hear and too persistent to miss, the runes pulsed once beneath the suppression chains. Once. And then again. The runes pulsed twice beneath the suppression chains and then went quiet. Not dark. Quiet. The distinction mattered. Selene understood it the way she understood most things about the network, from the inside out through the particular intimacy of a bloodline that had been woven into the stone infrastructure of the continent for 300 years and did not stop existing simply because iron had been placed over the basin. The network breathed the way old things breathed, slowly, without urgency, with the absolute patience of something that had already outlasted one empire and was prepared to outlast another. She stood on the 6th step and felt it breathe, and let herself breathe with it. Below her the throne room was empty, and the torches were burning low, and somewhere in the south quarter the last of the ceasefire negotiations were producing the particular grinding quiet of a conflict that had run out of fuel. Not peace. Peace was built. This was the prior condition, the absence of immediate violence, the moment after the fire that allows you to assess what remains standing. She came down from the 6th step, not the 7th. The 7th was a decision that belonged to a different day, to the inquiry and the council vote and the long structural work of making permanent what tonight had only cracked open. Climbing to the seat on this night, with the smoke still drifting through the high windows and the blood still wet on Valor's forearm, would have been theater. She had never been interested in theater. She walked to the door. Valor was still there. He had not moved from the doorway, which meant he had watched her climb to the 6th step and stand there and look out across the room and come back down, and he had not said anything about any of it until she was beside him at the door. "The 6th step," he said. "The 6th step," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the gray iron eyes that were, she thought, different from the eyes she had studied from the edge of rooms for 3 years. Not different in color or structure, but in what was operating behind them. Something had been removed. The particular quality of a man who has been carrying weight he chose not to name and has set it down. Not the lightness of someone relieved of a burden they wanted to put down, but the more complicated quality of someone who has put down something they had become so accustomed to carrying that its absence has changed the way they stand. He was standing differently. She noticed this and filed it and did not say anything about it because it was not the moment for that conversation, and she had learned over 7 years of long-view patience that the moments you didn't force were the ones that eventually arrived on their own terms. "Come on," she said. They walked out of the throne room together into the hall. The inquiry convened on the 3rd day. The council chamber had been reorganized. The emergency session configuration cleared, the full council table restored with all 14 seats, plus 4 additional seats drawn from the territorial lord representatives who had been contacted during the distribution window and had made the journey to the capital in 2 days, which was fast enough to indicate that they had been positioned for exactly this eventuality. Celine had been positioned for exactly this eventuality. She sat not at the council table but in the witness position to the table's left, a chair on a slight raised platform, which was the formal inquiry position for primary testimony sources. She wore the dark wool she had been wearing for 3 years, not court dress, not anything that could be read as costuming. The mark was not suppressed. It burned at the edge of visible through the fabric of her collar with the steady baseline warmth of something that had stopped hiding. The documentation package was on the table in front of every council member. 14 copies plus 4 for the territorial representatives. Each copy had been verified by 3 independent archival sources and bore Aldrich Voss's authentication seal from the Northern Network, the seal of the 2 surviving court witnesses who had given recorded testimony, and the original treaty document's transcription verified against the primary copy that had been transported under armed escort from Voss's northern location to the capital overnight. The primary copy sat at the center of the council table. Celine looked at it. She had been 14 the first time she had seen the original treaty document, held it in her hands in a farmhouse cellar in the border territories. The paper old even then, the seals intact. Her own child's handwriting in the lower right corner in the careful letters of a girl who had been trained to read and write formal documentation before she had been trained to run. She had spent the next 7 years keeping it safe in a way that meant never keeping it near her, maintaining the separation between the proof and the person with a discipline that was sometimes its own kind of grief. Looking at it on the council table was different from how she had imagined it. She had imagined it as a moment of arrival, the culmination of a trajectory, the thing all the years had been pointing toward. What it actually felt like was more complicated than arrival. It felt like the moment after a very long physical effort when the body has stopped moving and is not yet sure what stillness means. Valor sat at the head of the council table. Not in a performance of authority. He wore working clothes, not court dress, the same practical dark wool he had been in for 3 days. But because the head of the table was where the king sat, and he was still the king, and pretending otherwise before the council had made its formal determination would have been a different kind of theater. He looked at the documentation in front of him with the expression she had been watching develop for 3 days. The one that had moved through the stages of a man confronting the full weight of an inheritance he had never properly examined and arriving, finally, at something that could be called honest. He had read the primary copy of the treaty document the previous night. She had been in the map room when he read it. Sitting in the chair on the other side of his desk, the chair Seraphine had installed, which she had occupied for 3 years and which Celine had settled into with a pragmatism that acknowledged it was the available chair, not a statement. She had watched him read the treaty document and the supporting testimony and the detailed account of the Shadow Purge's 4-day execution, and she had watched his face move through what it moved through and had not said anything and had not looked away. He had not looked up from the documents for 2 hours. When he finally set the last page down, he sat with his hands flat on the table for a long moment, looking at nothing, and then he said, "I was 12 years old." She had waited. "When this happened, I was 12. He said it with the flat precision of someone stating a fact that they are not using as an excuse but need to name accurately. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't know," she said. "But I chose not to ask later," he said. "When I could have. When the inconsistencies were there to find if I looked." His jaw was set. "I prioritized stability over truth." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not asking for absolution," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not telling you I was 12 because I'm looking for you to tell me it's not my fault." "I know," she said. "You're telling me because the record needs to be accurate." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. She had looked at him across the desk in the map room with the treaty document between them and the accumulated weight of 28 years in the room with them, and she had thought about Bryn, who had never asked for absolution either, and who had simply kept walking until she couldn't, and she had thought that the people who didn't ask for absolution were the only ones you could trust to do something useful with it if it was eventually offered. She had not offered it that night. It was too soon and they both knew it, but she had not moved from the chair either, which was its own kind of answer. Now she sat in the witness position in the council chamber and watched the 14 council members and 4 territorial representatives read the documentation they had been given, and she felt the mark burning steadily on her shoulder, and she waited. Ito. Veilor spoke first. He stood at the head of the table. Not formally, no prepared statement, just stood, and he said, "What you have in front of you is verified primary documentation of a treaty executed between my father, King Aldrich Draven, and the Lycan royal court 28 years ago. The treaty was signed in good faith by both parties. 17 hours after the signing, my father ordered the execution of the Lycan court under the cover of an alleged outbreak of blood fever. The deaths totaled 52 individuals, including 11 children. The records of those deaths were falsified, and the falsification was maintained by administrative instruction for 28 years. The council was silent. "I did not know the specific facts of this event until 3 days ago," he said. "I knew the Shadow Purge had occurred. I did not investigate it. I made that choice deliberately when I took the throne, on the grounds that the political stability of a new reign could not absorb the disruption of a retrospective inquiry." He paused. "That choice was wrong. Not strategically. Strategically, it was defensible. Wrong." He let the distinction sit without elaboration. "The inquiry before this council is to determine the formal acknowledgement of these events, the restoration of the Lycan dynastic record, and the structural reforms required to prevent the administrative mechanisms that enabled both the purge and its concealment from being available for future use." He looked at the council. "I am presenting this documentation myself," he said, "because the alternative is for someone else to present it, and for this council to spend the next 6 months arguing about whose version of the truth to believe. It is my father's crime. It happened under the Draven name. I am the Draven name currently sitting at this table. The presentation belongs to me." He sat. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then the oldest territorial representative, a lord from the far eastern border, who had been governing his territory for 40 years and had the particular physical quality of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by what people were capable of, said, "The child in the treaty document, the countersignature." He was looking at Celine. "That's her," Veilor said. The lord looked at her steadily. "How old were you?" he said. 8, she said. He looked at the treaty document on the table in front of him, at the child's careful handwriting in the lower right corner. He nodded once, Then he said to the room, "The inquiry is open." The inquiry lasted 11 days. Not because the facts were in dispute, the documentation was too complete for productive disputation, and the witnesses too specific in their testimony, and the administrative falsification records too detailed in their evidence of sustained deliberate concealment. The 11 days were the time it took to process what the facts meant and build the formal record that would survive the processing. Celine testified for 3 days. She sat in the witness position and she answered every question with the same precision she had applied to everything for 7 years. And she did not spare the council the specific details they needed to understand what the 4 days of the Shadow Purge had looked like from inside it. She told them about Bryn. She told them about the farmhouse cellar and the 3 weeks of border roads and the final morning in a stranger's barn where she had sat beside a woman who had given everything she had for a child she had been entrusted with. And she told it without performing grief because performed grief was theater. And theater was for people who needed the audience to understand what they were supposed to feel. The council understood. On the 4th day, General Cass testified. He came in with the particular quality of a man who has decided that the only position left available to him is honesty, because the alternative is worse, and he is too intelligent not to know it. He confirmed the existence of the intelligence network he had run inside the palace. He confirmed the Eastern Alliance coordination. He confirmed that he had received documentation of the Shadow Purge through a secondary channel 2 years ago. Not the full documentation package, but enough to understand the basic shape of what had happened, and had chosen to use it as political leverage rather than bring it to the council. He sat in the witness position for 6 hours. When it was over and the council had no more questions, he stood, and he looked at Celine across the chamber and he said, "The wolves who worked in my network, most of them didn't know the full picture. I want that on record." "It's on record," the council chair said. He left. Seraphine's testimony was shorter. She came in with the rubies still at her throat, which Celine thought either meant she had decided that adjusting her appearance for the proceedings was a concession she was not willing to make, or that the rubies were simply what she wore and she had too much composure to perform adjustment. She answered every question in the same pleasant, precise tone she used for everything. She confirmed that she had sent correspondence to Cass through an unauthorized channel. She confirmed she had known about the Eastern Alliance's interest in Celine before she told Cass. She did not explain her motivations because no one asked her to, and she did not offer them because she was Seraphine, and Seraphine did not offer things that were not required. When she stood to leave, she looked at Violor. He looked back. It was the kind of look that happened between two people who had understood their arrangement accurately and had both, in their different ways, reached the end of its utility. No recrimination in it. No apology. The particular clear-eyed conclusion of two people who had been genuinely honest with each other about what they were and who were being genuinely honest now about what they weren't. She walked out. The door closed. Valor was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the next name on the testimony list and said to the council chair, "Continue. What?" The vote came on the 11th day. Formal acknowledgement of the Shadow Purge as an act of state-sanctioned mass murder committed under the authority of King Aldrich Draven. Formal restoration of the Lycan dynastic record to the Imperial Historical Archive. Formal validation of Celine Virel's bloodline claim as the last documented heir of the Lycan royal line. 14 council seats. 4 territorial representatives, 18 votes, 15 for. 2 against. 1 abstention. The 2 against were the council seats that Cass had held longest, now occupied by emergency appointments who had not had time to fully process the implications and had voted their uncertainty rather than their position. The abstention was a territorial representative from the southern border who had sent a written note explaining that he believed the documentation was accurate and the acknowledgement necessary, but that he needed to return to his territory before the vote due to a border dispute and was casting the abstention rather than delay proceedings. 15-4. It was enough. The council chair read the formal determination into the record with the particular deliberate clarity of someone who understands that this specific reading will be quoted in historical documents for as long as the documents last. Celine sat in the witness position and listened to it and felt nothing for approximately 30 seconds. Then she felt something she did not have an adequate name for, Not relief, not triumph, not the arrival feeling she had half expected and half dreaded. Something older and less legible than any of those. Something that lived in the specific place where 7 years of sustained effort finally exhales and the body has to figure out what it was doing, all that force. For once, the force is no longer needed. She looked at the treaty document on the council table. She looked at the child's handwriting in the lower right corner. She thought about a woman named Bryn who had not asked for recognition and had not received it and had died in a barn in the border territories at the end of 3 weeks of giving everything she had for a reason she had not explained and had not needed to explain. She would make sure Bryn's name was in the record. It was not in the original documentation. Bryn had been palace staff, unremarkable, the kind of person that historical records did not survive into. Celine would put her there, specifically by name, with the account of what she had done and what it had cost. The things that were not recorded did not stop having happened, but they stopped being able to teach anyone anything, and what Bryn had done was the kind of thing the Empire needed to learn from. She stood. The council was still in session, but the vote had concluded and the witness position was released, and she walked to the chamber door and through it into the corridor. She stood in the corridor for a moment with her back against the stone wall and the mark blazing on her shoulder without suppression, and she breathed. The corridor was empty. The palace breathed around her with the specific texture of a place that was different than it had been 11 days ago. Not yet what it would become, not the rebuilt version that would take years of structural work to assemble, but different. The way a room is different after the thing it was built around has been removed, when what remains is the space where the thing was and everything that now has room to exist in that space. She heard the council chamber door open. Valor came out. He stopped when he saw her in the corridor, looked at her against the wall, looked at the mark visible through her collar, looked at her face. 15, he said. Yes. He nodded once. He leaned against the wall beside her. Not close, the appropriate distance. The distance they had been maintaining for 11 days of inquiry proceedings and brief tactical conversations in corridors and the occasional dinner in the map room that had started as working sessions and had gradually, without either of them apparently deciding to change its nature, become something that might be called a meal between people who wanted to be in the same room. They stood in the corridor side by side. The structural reforms, he said. The council agreed to open the formal process for Omega designation review. That's going to take— I know how long it's going to take, she said. I've read the administrative pathway documentation. If we push it through the standard review channels, it's 18 months minimum before anything binding is on the record. If we create a dedicated reform council with direct reporting to the throne, we can compress it to 8. He looked at her. A dedicated reform council, he said, with representation from the designated populations, not just the noble houses, she said. The noble houses don't know what the designation systems actually produce. The people inside them do. The noble houses won't accept a council with that composition without— Without what? She said. Without a fight? She looked at him. Good. Have the fight. The documentation is public now. The acknowledgement is on record. The noble houses can fight a reform council, or they can fight the territorial lords who just voted 15-2 in front of an open inquiry. Their choice. He was quiet for a moment. You've been planning the reform architecture, he said, while the inquiry was running. I've been planning the reform architecture for 3 years, she said. I had time. I was cleaning corridors. Something moved in his face, not quite the thing adjacent to a smile. Something past it, a more private expression that she had started noticing in the last 5 days, that appeared in the specific moments when she said something that landed in him without warning, and he did not try to manage the landing. The dedicated reform council, he said. Who chairs it? She looked at the corridor wall. Someone who knows the designation system from the inside, she said, and who has enough institutional credibility that the noble houses can't dismiss the position as performative. She paused. I have someone in mind. Who? She looked at him. Me, she said. He held her gaze. The council will argue that a council chaired by the validated Lycan heir is a conflict of— The council can argue, she said. You said that already. He was quiet. The 6 steps, he said. She looked at him. The throne room, he said. You stopped at the 6th step, not the 7th. She had been waiting for this conversation. She had been aware it was coming for 11 days, building in the margins of every other conversation they had managed to have, deferred by proceedings and decisions and the specific mutual understanding of 2 people who are both aware of what they are not yet talking about and who have separately decided not to force it before it was ready. The 7th step is a governance question, she said. It requires the Council's formal determination and a territorial ratification process that the reform work has to proceed. If I sit on that throne before the institutional scaffolding that makes it legitimate is in place, I've built on the same kind of nothing my mother's court was built on when your father came to it. He was listening. The purge succeeded, she said, because the Lycan court had power without institutional protection of that power. The seal script in the foundation, the treaty documents, the bloodline. All of it was real, and none of it was enough when someone came with 17 assassins and a willingness to falsify the records after. What I'm building has to be harder to falsify than that. It has to be embedded in the council structure and the territorial record, and the reform documentation before the throne is the question. She paused. The 7th step is not today. He looked at her. When? He said. When the Omega designation has been formally reviewed and the slave classification systems have been dismantled and the dedicated Reform Council has produced its first binding determination, she said. When those things are on record, then we talk about the 7th step. That's 2 years minimum, he said. Possibly 3. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. And during those 2 or 3 years, he said, the throne. The throne is where you are, she said, doing the work of moving the administration toward the reform timeline, the way you've been moving it for 11 days while I was in the witness position. He looked at her. That's not what I'm asking, he said. She looked back at him. She knew what he was asking. She had known for 5 days, had tracked it the way she tracked everything, through the accumulation of small signals that each meant little alone and together meant something she had not budgeted for in 7 years of a plan that had not included the specific variable of a man choosing to stop being what his father built in the middle of everything else. She had not budgeted for it. She was going to have to work with the actual conditions. Ask me something I can answer today, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the map room dinner. Tonight. She looked at the wall. Yes, she said. He nodded once. He pushed off the wall and walked back toward the council chamber, and she stayed against the wall and watched him go, and this time she did not look away. The South Quarter took 3 weeks to rebuild. The Market District fire had been contained before it reached the residential blocks, which was Rain's particular competence. He had organized the containment response in the middle of the ceasefire negotiations with the particular multitasking efficiency of a man who had been managing overlapping crises for long enough that parallel processing was simply how he operated. The damage was real and localized, and the capital's populations who had lived in the South Quarter came back to something that was diminished but standing, and the reconstruction began before the inquiry had even finished its proceedings. Celine walked the South Quarter on the 15th day. Not formally, not with a guard escort or an administrative delegation or any of the protocols that were beginning to attach themselves to her movements as the inquiry's determination was processed, and the capital's population developed an understanding of who the woman in the dark wool actually was. She walked it early in the morning before the city was fully awake, with the mark visible through her collar and the blade she had carried for 3 years still at her hip because old habits were hard to remove, and also because she was not naive. The quarter smelled of ash and fresh-cut timber and the specific mineral quality of wet stone after demolition. Workers moved through it with the purposeful noise of reconstruction, hammers, voices, the rhythmic sound of people doing the concrete work of remaking something that had been damaged. She walked through it and looked at it and thought about what she had said to Cass in the throne room, that Voss had been told to look for wolves who had something to be angry about and had been waiting long enough that the anger had turned into patience. The quarter was full of those wolves, had been for years, would be for years to come, because the structural conditions that produced them hadn't changed yet. The inquiry's determination had cracked the foundation of those conditions. The reform process would chip away at the machinery of them, and none of that happened overnight, or even over years in the way that fire happened. It happened the way old stone wore, slowly, continuously, requiring the sustained application of pressure over time. She thought about sustained pressure over time. She thought about what she was actually built for. A woman sitting on the broken step of a half-demolished storefront looked up as she passed. Mid-40s, working clothes, the kind of face that had been weathered by the specific combination of outdoor labor and indoor anxiety that characterized the South Quarter's permanent residents. She had a small child leaning against her knee, half asleep. The woman looked at Celine's collar, at the mark visible there. Something moved in her face, not the formal deference of a subject encountering authority, but something more complicated and less performed. The particular expression of someone who has heard something they have not yet decided whether to believe and is encountering the evidence directly for the first time. Celine stopped. She crouched to the child's eye level. The child was 3, possibly 4, with the unfocused morning quality of someone who had been awake for an hour and was not committed to the state. The child looked at her, at the light at her collar. "Bright?" the child said. "Yes," Celine said. She stood. She looked at the woman. "The South Quarter reconstruction materials are coming from the Imperial Warehouse allocation," she said. "If the allocation isn't reaching this block, send word to the Reform Council intake point at the East Quarter Administrative Office. The address will be posted today." The woman looked at her. "The Reform Council," she said. It was not quite a question. She was testing the words. "It convenes next week," Celine said. "You can send testimony. You can send complaints. You can send requests. All of it goes on record." The woman looked at her for a moment. "Does it actually go somewhere?" she said. The directness of the question was not disrespect. It was the directness of someone who had been in the South Quarter long enough to have learned precisely how much official assurance was worth. "I chair it," Celine said. "So, yes." The woman looked at her. "All right," she said. Celine walked on. She walked for 2 hours through the South Quarter and then back north through the main market district, through the eastern residential blocks, through the servant quarter that abutted the palace's exterior wall. The servant quarter was the part of the city she knew best from the outside, which was different from the inside. From outside, it looked like what it was, a residential district packed too tight for the population it housed, the buildings narrow and the streets narrow, and the yards where they existed small and shared and used intensely. The people who lived here worked in the palace and the noble quarter and the administrative district and came home to this, and the distance between where they worked and where they lived was not only physical. She thought about what it would take to close that distance. Not the infrastructure. The infrastructure was downstream of the structural conditions. The designation systems that sorted wolves into categories that then determined what they were permitted to build toward. The economic mechanisms that tied designation to wage rates and property access and educational availability and the dozen other variables that compounded designation into something that replicated itself across generations with the particular self-reinforcing efficiency of any system that benefits from its own continuation. 7 years of planning had given her a clear-eyed understanding of exactly how entrenched those mechanisms were. 7 years of planning had also given her a clear-eyed understanding of what it took to move entrenched things. Patience, sustained pressure, the willingness to work the problem at the level of the actual machinery rather than the level of the symbol, because symbols were necessary but they were not sufficient, and confusing the two was how reform movements built monuments instead of change. She had not come back to this empire to build a monument. She turned back toward the palace. The map room in the evening was different from the map room in the early morning hours when she had first been brought into it. The lamp was on the central table where Veilor had placed it 11 days ago. The map still covered the walls. She had started adding to them, over the last week, in the particular absent way of someone who is working while having dinner and does not notice they are doing it until the work is visible. There were 3 new notations in the northwestern sector that she had made while reviewing the territorial lord correspondence from the inquiry distribution, and a correction to the eastern border demarcation that the current map had wrong by approximately 6 kilometers. She had not asked permission to annotate his maps. He had not commented on the annotations. She sat across the desk from him with the evening meal between them, and the lamp burning, and the maps on the walls, and the specific quality of a room in which two people have stopped performing and are simply present in the same space. Cass's Eastern Alliance, she said. 3 of the 4 constituent territories have sent formal acknowledgement of the inquiry determination, he said. The 4th is the Veldrath borderland, which is complicated by the fact that Veldrath's lord was personally close to my father. He's not going to accept the determination easily. He doesn't have to accept it easily, she said. He has to accept it formally. Those are different things. Yes. He looked at the northeastern map section. Reen thinks we need a diplomatic mission to the Veldrath borderland before the Reform Council's first session. Establish the formal relationship before the policy questions reach him through documentation rather than conversation. Who goes? I was going to go, he said. Then I thought you might want to. She looked at him. I've never been to the Veldrath borderland, she said. I know. The lord there was at my mother's court 3 months before the Shadow Purge, she said. He sent congratulations on the treaty signing. The documentation includes his signature on the witness list. Valor was quiet. He knows what he signed, she said. He spent 28 years knowing. Yes, Valor said. Then he should hear it from me, she said. Not from a diplomatic dispatch. From me directly, in person, in his own hall. Valor held her gaze. That's going to be a difficult conversation, he said. I've had difficult conversations, she said. He nodded slowly. We'll both go, he said. She looked at him. Together, he said, without elaborating, which meant he was not going to elaborate, which meant the word was doing the work of everything that had been developing in corridor conversations and map room dinners, and the particular proximity of 2 people who had been through something together that changed the shape of what they each understood proximity to mean. She looked at the maps. Together, she said. The lamp burned. She went to the Foundation chamber alone on the 22nd day. Not for the network. Not to send a pulse or receive a signal or press her hands into the basin and open herself to 60 kilometers of stone-carried information. She went because she had not been back since the suppression chains had been placed over the basin, and the chains had been removed on the 15th day by Rain's people under her instruction, and she had not yet gone back, and there was a conversation she needed to have with the room that she had been putting off, in the way you put off the conversations that are necessary and private and do not benefit from being further deferred. The chamber was quiet. The runes were still running, lower than the full activation of the crisis days, a sustainable baseline hum that she thought would probably settle into this rhythm permanently. The network no longer dormant, but no longer blaring either, operating in the intermediate register of something that had found its own level after the pressure that had built for 28 years had been released. The basin held 2 inches of the silver-white fluid back to its usual level. The overflow was gone. The walls were the same. The dynastic seal script cycling through its activation sequences in the north to south current. The 300 years of carved stone doing what it had been built to do, holding the record of a line that had extended into this moment through an 8-year-old girl in a food cellar and a woman who had kept walking. Celine sat beside the basin. She did not put her hands in it. She sat beside it and looked at the fluid and the light and the walls, and she sat with what the room held. The weight of everything it represented, the 300 years of it, the 28 years of silence, the 7 years of work, and the 11 days of inquiry, and what came after the inquiry. She thought about the things that had been lost that could not be restored. Not abstractly. Specifically. The 41 adults. The 11 children. The names she had memorized from the witness testimony, had said into the council's formal record, would ensure appeared in every historical document that emerged from the inquiry. Bryn, the other palace staff who had died in the 4 days, who would not appear in the primary documentation because they had been too unremarkable for the historical records machinery to pick up, and who she had been quietly compiling a secondary list for to be appended to the formal inquiry record at the first Reform Council session. The things that had been lost that could not be restored were specific, and she was going to hold them specifically because the alternative was to let them become abstract, and abstract losses became rhetorical, and rhetorical losses became the kind of thing that was invoked in political arguments rather than grieved. She was going to grieve them specifically. She sat in the foundation chamber and she did this, alone, without performance, for as long as it took. It took a while. She had been compressing this particular thing for a long time, the same way she had compressed the mark and the network and everything else that needed to be kept cold and dark and hidden in the years when exposure would have ended everything. The compression was no longer necessary. She let it go. When she was done, she sat in the quiet for a while longer, feeling the runes breathe around her and the basin hold its light, and she thought about what came after. Not the Reform Council or the Veldrath mission or the seventh step and the years of structural work it required. Not the map room or the dinner table or the question of what two people who had been adversaries and had become something else were going to call what they had become. She thought about what came after in the way you think about the horizon. Not as a destination, but as the thing that tells you the direction. The territory between here and there was real and specific and would require everything she had, and she had, at this point, a clearer read on what she actually had than she had possessed at any previous point in her life. She had survived being 8 years old in a burning court. She had survived 17 years of positioning and suppression and the daily discipline of being present in the place of her own destruction without letting the destruction finish. She had the bloodline and the network and the documentation and the council vote and the mark burning steadily on her shoulder with the baseline warmth of something that had stopped hiding. She had a man in a map room who had stopped being what his father built and was still learning the shape of his own hands without the weight he had set down, and who had looked at her standing on the sixth step and said when and meant it as a question about the future rather than the present. She was 28 years old. She had time. She pressed her palm against the edge of the basin, not inside it, just the edge, the stone rim, the physical boundary of the thing, and she held it there for a moment. The runes pulsed once, slow, deep. The long, patient heartbeat of something that had been waiting for a very long time and had stopped waiting. She took her hand back. She stood. She climbed back through the passage, through the linen room, through the corridor, up the stairs, and into the hall of the palace that had been built over the bones of what her family had been, and she walked through it with the mark visible, and her hand steady, and the particular quality of a woman who has finished the first part of something and is beginning the second. The hall was starting to fill with the morning staff, the servants moving through their rotations, the administrative staff arriving at their stations, the ordinary machinery of the palace day beginning to operate. People looked at her, and the quality of the looking had changed over 22 days from the careful non-looking of staff encountering a servant to something more uncertain, more searching, still working out the category. She let them look. She was not going to be invisible again. She had been very good at it for 3 years, and it had served its purpose, and that purpose was finished, and what she was now, what the inquiry had put on record, what the mark blazed on her shoulder, what the rune network hummed in the stone beneath all their feet, was not invisible. It was simply present. She walked toward the map room and the morning's work. But the obsidian throne sat on its dais in the empty throne room, as it had sat for 30 years, as it would sit for the years of structural work that preceded the seventh step. On the day the throne room was next used for a formal court session, 3 weeks after the inquiry's conclusion, the first court session under the new governance structure that the Reform Council would be embedded in, someone had placed a small object on the armrest of the throne, a folded piece of old paper. Celine found it before the court assembled, during the brief period when the throne room was empty and she was walking through it on her way to the Reform Council's preparation meeting. She picked it up and unfolded it. Inside was a child's drawing, the kind a 4-year-old makes, approximate shapes, heavy crayon lines, the particular confident inaccuracy of someone who draws what they mean rather than what they see. A woman with silver lines around her head, which she understood was meant to be the mark, a palace, something that was possibly a moon. Under the drawing, in adult handwriting that she did not recognize, from the South Quarter, for what comes next. She stood in the empty throne room and held the drawing and felt what she felt without compressing it, which was something she was practicing with the deliberate effort of someone relearning a thing they had disabled for a necessary period. She folded the drawing carefully. She put it in the pocket of the dark wool. She walked to the Reform Council's preparation meeting. Ishsan. Violor found the throne room empty that morning. He stood at the entrance to it for a moment, looking at the obsidian throne on its dais at the far end, the 7 steps, the torchlight on the carved volcanic stone. He had stood in this room's entrance 100 times in 11 years, and it had never looked like this, not different in its physical content, but different in the quality of what he was bringing to it, which was the variable that determined what a room actually was. He walked across the floor. He stopped at the base of the dais steps. He looked up. The throne was not something he had ever particularly wanted. He had understood this about himself early, had understood that what he had wanted was the thing he associated with the throne, which was the end of the particular fear he had grown up inside, the specific dread of a child raised by a man like Aldrich Draven, for whom power was the only reliable defense against everything the world was capable of. He had taken the throne because it was there, and because the alternative was to let someone else take it who would use it the way his father had, and he had spent 11 years governing from it with the particular quality of a man who is doing a necessary thing and knows it is necessary and does not mistake necessary for chosen. He had never chosen it. He was choosing it now. The distinction was the difference between carrying something because you couldn't put it down and picking it up because you had decided it was the right thing to carry. What he was choosing was not the throne. The throne was furniture, stone, and craft, and the accumulated symbolism of 30 years of his family's specific approach to power. What he was choosing was what the room could be used for, what the position could be used for, what the empire that was currently in the process of learning that it had been built on the wrong foundation could become if the people who held the foundation's weight decided that what they were building toward was worth the building. He thought about a woman who had spent 7 years on the right approach, who had stood on the 6th step and told him when as though it were simply information, who had annotated his maps without asking and corrected his eastern border demarcation by 6 kilometers, and was currently, he was fairly certain, already in the Reform Council preparation meeting, even though it didn't start for another 40 minutes. He climbed the 7 steps. He sat. The throne was not comfortable. It had never been comfortable. It was not designed for comfort. It was designed for impression, which was its own kind of information about how his father had understood what a seat of governance was for. He sat in it anyway with his back straight and his forearms on the armrests, and he looked out across the empty throne room from the height that he had looked out from for 11 years, and it looked different, not smaller, larger, the way a room looks when you stop managing your relationship to it and simply occupy it. Rain appeared in the doorway. He took in Violor on the throne, and something moved in his face. Not surprise exactly, but the expression of a man who has been waiting for something for a long time and is adjusting to seeing it. "The Eastern Council representatives are arriving," Rain said, "and Lady Celine's Reform Council preparation meeting starts in 40 minutes. "I know," Valor said. "The court session is in 3 hours." "I know." Rain was quiet for a moment. "Anything you need, Your Majesty?" Valor looked at the room. "Send word to the South Quarter Reconstruction Coordinator," he said. "The materials allocation for the Eastern blocks. I want a direct audit. The numbers coming back from the distribution center don't match the release orders." "Yes, Your Majesty." "And tell Commander Aldrich and the Secretariat to start pulling the Veldrath borderland diplomatic file. We'll need briefing materials for a mission in the next 2 weeks." "We, Your Majesty?" Valor looked at the doorway. "Lady Celine and I," he said. "We're going together." Rain absorbed this. "Yes, Your Majesty," he said. He turned to go. "Rain." He stopped. "The cracked crown," Valor said. "My father's. It's in the archive storage. I want it retrieved." Rain turned back. Something careful moved in his expression. "For what purpose, if I may?" "I don't know yet," Valor said. "But it belongs somewhere visible, not in storage." He paused. "Somewhere people can see it. Not as a trophy, not as a monument to what the Draven bloodline had built, as proof of something more specific, that the things men built from fear and conquest, and the willingness to bury what they had done could still be broken, and that broken things did not disappear but became something else, something harder and clearer and less easy to mistake for what it was not. The crack down the center of the crown was not a flaw. It was the most honest thing in the palace. Rain nodded once and left. Valor sat on the obsidian throne in the empty hall and watched the morning light move through the high windows and felt the empire he had governed for 11 years beginning, slowly, to become something he had chosen. In the stone beneath his feet, too deep for anyone standing on the surface to hear, the runes breathed. And in the south quarter of the capital of Arkoros, a woman who had climbed to the 6th step took out a child's drawing from her pocket and looked at it for a moment before the work began. For what comes next? Yes,